Good evening. Tonight, we're stepping away from the rush of the modern day and setting sail across the shimmering Aegean. As you get comfortable, let the world go quiet and imagine yourself among the sun-bleached hills of ancient Greece. Feel the evening air turn cool and fresh, carrying the scent of wild thyme, the salt of the sea, and the gentle, sweet aroma of wood smoke from a nearby hearth. Imagine a world where the gods aren't distant spirits, but neighbors who meddle in your marriage, your harvests, and your wars. Imagine a rugged, sun-drenched peninsula where a simple farmer might spend his morning behind a plow and his afternoon debating the nature of justice in a crowded marketplace. This was not a world of dusty ruins and silent statues, but a vibrant, chaotic, and high-stakes experiment in what it means to be human. This was ancient Greece. From the jagged peaks of Mount Olympus to the salt-sprayed shores of the Aegean, the Greeks were driven by a singular, restless obsession, arete, or excellence. It was an itch that couldn't be scratched, a fire that pushed them to build temples that defied gravity, to write plays that explored the deepest traumas of the soul, and to stand their ground against the greatest empire the world had ever seen. They didn't just live life, they interrogated it. Every pillar of our modern world, the way we vote, the way we argue, the way we compete, and even the way we think, was forged in the heat of their city-states. We are all, in some small way, citizens of their polis. So, take a breath and prepare to step back into the navel of the world, where the air is thick with the scent of olive oil and the echoes of 1,000 years of genius. The stage is set, the oracle has spoken, and the race is about to begin. The Minoan civilization rose like a mirage from the dust of Crete, fueled by the relentless Mediterranean sun and the boundless potential of the sea. While the rest of Europe remained largely shrouded in the shadows of prehistory, the people of Crete were weaving a sophisticated tapestry of art, trade, and engineering. They did not merely survive on their island, they mastered it, turning the rugged landscape into a garden of olives and grapes that would feed an empire. Life pulsed through the veins of massive, sprawling palace complexes, the most famous of which was Knossos. These were not fortresses in the traditional sense, but living organisms, labyrinthine structures of stone and timber that served as administrative hubs, religious sanctuaries, and vast storehouses. To walk through their corridors was to experience a marvel of ancient innovation, featuring multi-story light wells and advanced plumbing that would not be seen again for millennia. Perhaps most striking to the modern eye is the total absence of defensive walls. In an era where cities were typically defined by their fortifications, the Minoans stood exposed and unafraid. This suggests a rare golden era of thalassocracy, a peace maintained by a supreme navy. They didn't need stone walls when the wine-dark sea itself served as their moat, patrolled by the most advanced fleet the ancient world had ever known. The economy was a vibrant dance of exchange. Minoan ships laden with exquisite Kamares-ware pottery and jars of gold and olive oil zipped between the Cyclades, Egypt, and the Levant. They were the great middlemen of the Bronze Age, returning with copper from Cyprus, tin from the far west, and exotic luxuries that fueled the appetites of the palace elites. Every port call was an infusion of new ideas, making Crete the world's first true cultural melting pot. Among their most precious exports was saffron, the red gold harvested from the autumn crocus.
This labor-intensive spice was more than a seasoning. It was a status symbol, a dye for the robes of priestesses, and a potent medicine. The frescoes adorning the palace walls depict saffron gatherers with delicate precision, illustrating a society that found profound beauty and religious significance in the natural world. Religion in Minoan Crete was a shadowy, earth-centric affair, likely dominated by a powerful mother goddess. Unlike the later Greeks who looked to the sky-dwelling Olympians, the Minoans looked to the caves, the peaks, and the deep tremors of the earth. Their rituals were held in sacred groves and mountain sanctuaries, where the scent of honey and incense mingled with the salty air, honoring deities who governed the cycles of birth and harvest. At the heart of this spiritual life was the bull. More than just a beast of burden, the bull was a symbol of raw subterranean power, perhaps a personification of the earthquakes that frequently rocked the island. The animal was revered and challenged in equal measure, its image carved into every seal stone and painted on every ritual vessel, serving as the ultimate icon of Minoan strength. This reverence culminated in the breathtaking spectacle of bull leaping. In the central courtyards of the palaces, beneath the gaze of thousands, young men and women performed gravity-defying stunts. They would sprint toward a charging bull, grab its horns, and somersault over its massive back. This was not a sport of slaughter, but a dangerous, beautiful dialogue between human agility and animal ferocity, a dance on the edge of a knife. The aesthetics of Minoan life reflected this fluidity. Their art was defined by movement, dolphins leaping through waves, lilies swaying in the breeze, and slender-waisted figures with cascading dark curls. Unlike the rigid frontal statues of Egypt, Minoan figures are often captured in mid-motion, as if the artist sought to freeze a single joyful heartbeat in time before the Mediterranean wind could carry it away. Though their civilization would eventually succumb to the fires of conquest and the cataclysm of volcanic eruptions, the Minoan legacy remained etched into the bedrock of Western history. They provided the blueprint for the Greek world, leaving behind the legend of the labyrinth and the memory of a society that chose trade over walls and art over iron. For a few brilliant centuries, they were the undisputed masters of the blue expanse, living in a sun-drenched harmony that still captivates the imagination.
As the soft maritime elegance of the Minoans began to wane, a harsher sun rose over the Greek mainland. The Mycenaeans, the first true Greeks of the Bronze Age, emerged not as peaceful traders of the sea, but as a formidable warrior elite. Where the Minoans built light wells and open courtyards, the Mycenaeans built strongholds. Their rise signaled a shift in the Mediterranean soul, from the fluid beauty of the islander to the iron-willed discipline of the mountaineer. At the heart of this civilization were the Cyclopean fortresses, massive citadels perched on craggy heights like Mycenae and Tiryns. These walls were constructed from limestone boulders so gargantuan that later generations of Greeks, stumbling upon the ruins, could not believe human hands had moved them. They theorized that only the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of myth, possessed the strength to hoist such stones into place. These walls weren't just functional, they were a psychological statement of unshakable power. Access to these citadels was often guarded by iconic architecture, most notably the Lion Gate. This massive relief, depicting two lions flanking a central pillar, stood as a heraldic warning to any who approached. It represented the Wanax, or High King, whose authority was absolute.
Unlike the sprawling, unfortified palaces of Crete, the Mycenaean palace was a nerve center of military administration, designed to withstand a siege and overlook the fertile plains below with a predator's eye. Inside these walls, the center of life was the megaron. This was a grand rectangular hall with a central hearth, surrounded by 4 ornate pillars. The air here didn't smell of sea spray and lilies, but of roasting meat and wood smoke. It was in the megaron that the warrior king held court, surrounded by his hecatai, his noble companions and military officers. Here the politics of the sword were hashed out over deep draughts of wine, and the songs of bards first began to shape the oral traditions of the Iliad. The Mycenaean aesthetic was defined by the clatter and gleam of bronze. They were masters of metallurgy, forging long leaf-shaped swords and the famous dendra panoply, a heavy, articulated bronze armor that transformed a man into a living tank. While the Minoans celebrated the acrobatics of the bull leap, the Mycenaeans celebrated the efficiency of the chariot. In the dusty plains of the Peloponnese, the thunder of wheels and the flash of spear tips were the true measures of a man's worth. Wealth in this society was not merely traded, it was hoarded and buried. The shaft graves and tholos tombs of Mycenae have yielded some of the most spectacular treasures of antiquity. The most famous among these is the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, a funerary mask of hammered gold that covered the face of a fallen king. These masks were intended to preserve the fierce visage of the ruler for eternity, ensuring that even in death his majesty remained untarnished. This was an age of intense bureaucracy, captured in the scratchings of linear B on clay tablets. These records reveal a society obsessed with inventory. How many chariot wheels were in the armory, how many sheep were owed in tax, and how much bronze was allocated to the smiths. It was a top-down command economy designed to fuel a permanent war machine. Every artisan and farmer was a gear in a clockwork system dedicated to the prestige of the palace. The Mycenaean religion also took on a darker, more structured hue. While they adopted some Minoan deities, they began to elevate the precursors of the Olympian gods. Poseidon was a major figure, though he was often associated with the terrifying earth-shaker aspect of the sea and land. Rituals were somber and precise, involving animal sacrifices intended to win the favor of gods who were as fickle and violent as the kings who worshipped them. The climax of this era is immortalized in the legends of the Trojan War. While the Homeric epics were written centuries later, they echo the reality of Mycenaean expansionism. This was a civilization that pushed its boundaries, launching massive naval expeditions to the shores of Asia Minor in search of resources, glory, and control over trade routes. The face that launched 1,000 ships may be a poetic invention, but the reality of Mycenaean fleets darkening the horizon was a terrifying fact of life for their neighbors. Ultimately, the very strength of the Mycenaeans became their undoing. Their rigid, palace-centered systems were vulnerable to the systemic Bronze Age collapse, a perfect storm of internal revolt, droughts, and the mysterious Sea Peoples. By 1100 BC, the great lion-guarded gates were broken, the gold was looted, and the art of writing was lost. Greece spiraled into a dark age, leaving behind only the massive silent stones and the echoes of a warrior's song that would one day become the foundation of Western literature. Around 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean world experienced a systemic failure so profound it remains one of history's greatest mysteries. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single event, but a cascading domino effect of droughts, famines, internal revolts, and the shadowy sea peoples who harried the coasts. The mighty Mycenaean citadels, once symbols of unshakable power, were put to the torch. The grand administrative machines ground to a halt, and the golden masks of kings were buried under layers of ash and silence. As the palaces burned, the complex social structures they supported evaporated. This was the beginning of the Dark Age, a period characterized by a dramatic loss of sophisticated culture. The most devastating casualty was the art of writing. The linear B script, used by palace bureaucrats to track harvests and armories, vanished entirely. Without a central government to mandate its use, the knowledge of how to record language died with the scribes, leaving Greece in a state of historical amnesia for nearly 4 centuries. The architectural landscape transformed from stone monuments to humble subsistence. The Cyclopean walls were abandoned to the elements, and the survivors retreated into the hills or small isolated coastal pockets. Instead of grand megarons, the Greeks now lived in small one-room huts made of mud brick and timber with thatched roofs. Life became local, insular, and excruciatingly difficult, as the interconnected trade networks that once brought tin from Britain and gold from Egypt snapped. In this new reality, the economy shifted from international commerce to basic pastoralism. The clatter of bronze chariots was replaced by the gentle tinkling of sheep bells. Wealth was no longer measured in intricately carved ivory or imported gemstones, but in the size of one's herd and the fertility of a small patch of rocky soil. For the average person, the world shrank to the distance they could walk in a day, and the wine-dark sea became a barrier rather than a highway. Yet the poverty of material did not mean a poverty of spirit. Even in these lean centuries, the Greeks maintained a sense of identity through their communal life. In the evenings, when the labor of the day was done, villagers would gather around a central fire. In the flickering light, the harshness of their thatch-roofed reality would fade as they listened to the Iodoi, the traveling bards. These poets were the living archives of a race that had forgotten how to write, but refused to forget how to remember. These bards sang rhythmic, formulaic poems that recounted the deeds of the men of old. They told of high-walled cities, glittering bronze armor, and heroes who were taller, stronger, and closer to the gods than any living man. To a shepherd living in a mud hut, these stories were not just entertainment, they were a lifeline to a glorious heritage. The bards used specific mnemonic devices and repetitive epithets like swift-footed Achilles and gray-eyed Athena to preserve the core of the narrative through generations of oral transmission. This oral tradition was the crucible in which the Greek spirit was forged. While the material culture was at its lowest ebb, the language and the mythology were being refined and expanded. The stories of the Trojan War and the wanderings of Odysseus began to take their final shapes during these dark centuries. The bards acted as a cultural glue, ensuring that a Greek in the Peloponnese and a Greek in Ionia shared the same pantheon of gods and the same code of heroic honor, arete. Religion during this time became more personal and rustic. The grand state ceremonies of the Mycenaean era gave way to local shrines and simple offerings of grain or wool. The gods were no longer distant figures managed by a palace elite. They were the invisible neighbors who lived in the springs, the ancient trees, and the mountain peaks. This period saw the slow evolution of the Olympian pantheon into the characters we recognize today, as local myths were woven together by the bards into a national tapestry. Technologically, a quiet revolution was taking place beneath the surface of the Dark Age. With the supply of tin for bronze cut off by the collapse of trade, smiths began to experiment with the more abundant, though harder to work, iron ore. The Iron Age was born of necessity. While less beautiful than the golden bronze of their ancestors, iron tools and weapons were more durable and accessible to the common man, eventually democratizing warfare and agriculture. By the time the sun began to rise again on the Greek world around 800 BCE, the people who emerged were very different from their Mycenaean ancestors. They were tougher, more independent, and unified by a massive body of oral literature that was finally ready to be written down using a new, more flexible alphabet. The Dark Age was not a void, but a long winter, a period of dormant energy where the seeds of the Iliad.
As the 8th century BCE progressed, the isolated hamlets of the Dark Age began to merge, driven by a sudden and dramatic surge in population. This demographic boom forced a radical reorganization of Greek life. The old loose-knit tribal loyalties, where a man's identity was tied strictly to his bloodline and his chieftain, began to crack under the pressure of growth. In their place emerged the polis, the city-state, a revolutionary political experiment that would define the Mediterranean for a millennium. The polis was far more than a simple collection of houses and markets. It was a psychological and spiritual shared identity. It represented a shift from the who you are of the tribe to the where you belong of the citizen. This new structure demanded a level of civic cooperation never before seen in the West. It required farmers, artisans, and aristocrats to see themselves as parts of a single, functioning organism bound by a common set of laws and a mutual destiny. At the physical and emotional heart of every polis stood the Acropolis, or High City. Originally chosen for its defensive advantages, this rugged limestone citadel evolved into the city's sacred crown. While the people lived in the lower city, Asti, or the surrounding countryside, Choa, the Acropolis remained the dwelling place of the gods. To look up from a dusty field and see the gleaming marble of a temple on the heights was to be reminded of the permanence and divine protection of one's home. The Acropolis served as a literal and metaphorical anchor. In times of war, the massive walls of the citadel offered sanctuary to the entire population, including the rural farmers and their livestock. In times of peace, it was the site of the city's most important festivals and treasury. It was the visual shorthand for the state's power, signaling to both friend and foe that this patch of earth was occupied by a people who had the will and the resources to build toward the heavens. As this civic identity solidified, the concept of the citizen was born. A Greek man no longer defined his worth solely by his family name or his father's wealth. He defined it by his status as a member of the polis. Citizenship was an exclusive and sacred club, carrying both heavy responsibilities and distinct privileges. It meant the right to speak in the assembly, the right to own land, and the duty to participate in the religious life of the community. This sense of belonging was inextricably tied to the land itself. A citizen of Athens felt a physical, spiritual connection to the silver mines of Laurium and the olive groves of the Attic plain that a citizen of Sparta or Corinth did not. The borders of the polis were not just lines on a map, they were the limits of one's world. To be exiled from your city was considered a fate worse than death, for to be without a polis was to be a man without a shadow, a person with no legal standing or divine protection. The rise of the polis also revolutionized warfare. The old Homeric model of individual heroes engaging in single combat gave way to the hoplite phalanx.
In this new system, citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to create a wall of bronze. This required a profound level of trust. You were not just fighting for your own glory, but for the man standing next to you. The phalanx was the polis in military form, a group of equals working in perfect, disciplined unison to defend their collective home. Religion also became politicized in the best sense of the word. While the Greeks shared a common pantheon, each polis adopted a specific deity as its primary protector. Athena belonged to Athens, Hera to Argos, and Artemis to Ephesus. These polis deities were thought to reside within the city's walls, taking a direct interest in its politics and wars. To serve the gods was to serve the state, and the great Panathenea, or the Dionysia, were not just religious rites, but massive celebrations of the city's own greatness. The physical layout of the city reflected this new focus on public life. Near the base of the Acropolis lay the Agora, the open-air marketplace and civic center. Here the noise of the modern world that we sought to leave behind actually began. The Agora was a swirl of philosophy, gossip, trade, and legal disputes. It was the living room of the polis, where the identity of the citizen was practiced and refined daily through heated debate and the exchange of ideas. By the dawn of the classical age, the polis had become the laboratory of Western civilization. From this intense, localized focus on one's own patch of earth came the foundations of democracy, formal logic, and tragedy. The Greeks had discovered that by shrinking their focus to a single city-state, they could expand the boundaries of the human mind.
As the 8th century BCE progressed, the isolated hamlets of the Dark Age began to merge, driven by a sudden and dramatic surge in population. This demographic boom forced a radical reorganization of Greek life. The old, loose-knit tribal loyalties, where a man's identity was tied strictly to his bloodline and his chieftain, began to crack under the pressure of growth. In their place emerged the polis, the city-state, a revolutionary political experiment that would define the Mediterranean for a millennium. The polis was far more than a simple collection of houses and markets. It was a psychological and spiritual shared identity. It represented a shift from the who you are of the tribe to the where you belong of the citizen. This new structure demanded a level of civic cooperation never before seen in the West. It required farmers, artisans, and aristocrats to see themselves as parts of a single functioning organism, bound by a common set of laws and a mutual destiny. At the physical and emotional heart of every polis stood the Acropolis, or High City. Originally chosen for its defensive advantages, this rugged limestone citadel evolved into the city's sacred crown. While the people lived in the lower city, Asti, or the surrounding countryside, Chora, the Acropolis remained the dwelling place of the gods. To look up from a dusty field and see the gleaming marble of a temple on the heights was to be reminded of the permanence and divine protection of one's home. The Acropolis served as a literal and metaphorical anchor. In times of war, the massive walls of the citadel offered sanctuary to the entire population, including the rural farmers and their livestock. In times of peace, it was the site of the city's most important festivals and treasury. It was the visual shorthand for the state's power, signaling to both friend and foe that this patch of earth was occupied by a people who had the will and the resources to build toward the heavens. As this civic identity solidified, the concept of the citizen was born. A Greek man no longer defined his worth solely by his family name or his father's wealth. He defined it by his status as a member of the polis. Citizenship was an exclusive and sacred club,
carrying both heavy responsibilities and distinct privileges. It meant the right to speak in the assembly, the right to own land, and the duty to participate in the religious life of the community. This sense of belonging was inextricably tied to the land itself. A citizen of Athens felt a physical, spiritual connection to the silver mines of Laurium and the olive groves of the Attic plain that a citizen of Sparta or Corinth did not. The borders of the polis were not just lines on a map, they were the limits of one's world. To be exiled from your city was considered a fate worse than death, for to be without a polis was to be a man without a shadow, a person with no legal standing or divine protection. The rise of the polis also revolutionized warfare. The old Homeric model of individual heroes engaging in single combat gave way to the hoplite phalanx. In this new system, citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to create a wall of bronze. This required a profound level of trust. You were not just fighting for your own glory, but for the man standing next to you. The phalanx was the polis in military form, a group of equals working in perfect, disciplined unison to defend their collective home. Religion also became politicized in the best sense of the word. While the Greeks shared a common pantheon, each polis adopted a specific deity as its primary protector. Athena belonged to Athens, Hera to Argos, and Artemis to Ephesus. These polyous deities were thought to reside within the city's walls, taking a direct interest in its politics and wars. To serve the gods was to serve the state, and the great Panathenea or the Dionysia were not just religious rites, but massive celebrations of the city's own greatness. The physical layout of the city reflected this new focus on public life. Near the base of the Acropolis lay the Agora, the open-air marketplace and civic center. Here, the noise of the modern world that we sought to leave behind actually began. The Agora was a swirl of philosophy, gossip, trade, and legal disputes. It was the living room of the polis, where the identity of the citizen was practiced and refined daily through heated debate and the exchange of ideas. By the dawn of the classical age, the polis had become the laboratory of Western civilization. From this intense localized focus on one's own patch of earth came the foundations of democracy, formal logic, and tragedy. The Greeks had discovered that by shrinking their focus to a single city-state, they could expand the boundaries of the human mind. While other Greek cities were flirting with the arts, philosophy, and the messy beauty of the marketplace, Sparta turned its back on the sea and looked inward. Nestled in the fertile but landlocked Eurotas Valley, the Spartans made a radical choice. They would not build walls of stone, but walls of men. This transformation was not accidental. It was a deliberate, totalizing restructuring of human life, designed to create the most formidable land force in the known world. This radical path was attributed to the semi-mythical lawmaker Lycurgus. Legend has it that after consulting the Delphic oracle, Lycurgus returned to Sparta with the Great Rhetra, a set of laws that dismantled the traditional Greek way of life. He sought to eliminate the twin cancers of society, greed and envy. To do this, he didn't just regulate wealth, he made it physically impossible to accumulate. He banned the minting of gold and silver, replacing them with heavy, cumbersome iron bars as the official currency. These iron bars were quenched in vinegar to make the metal brittle and worthless for any other use. If you wanted to store even a modest amount of wealth, you would need a team of oxen and a large room just to hold the cash. This effectively killed international trade and luxury imports. By removing the incentive for profit, Lycurgus ensured that no Spartan would waste their time in a shop or a counting house. In Sparta, the only business was war. With luxury erased, the city became a finely tuned machine where the individual was secondary to the collective. This was the birth of the agoge, the most rigorous state-sponsored education system in history. At the age of 7, boys were taken from their mothers and placed in communal barracks. They were underfed to encourage stealth and resourcefulness, dressed in a single cloak year-round to endure the elements, and subjected to a life of constant ritualized competition. Spartan society was structured around the concept of the homoioi, or the equals. In theory, every Spartan citizen was equal in status, lifestyle, and purpose. They ate together in communal mess halls called syssidia, where the menu was famously austere, including the black broth of boiled pig's blood and vinegar. By forcing even the kings to eat the same humble fare as the lowest citizen, Sparta forged a social cohesion that was unbreakable on the battlefield. This equality, however, was built upon a dark foundation, the helots. The Spartans were a tiny minority ruling over a vast population of enslaved Greeks who worked the land. To keep this restless majority in check, the Spartan state had to remain a permanent military camp. The equals couldn't afford the luxury of art or philosophy because their survival depended on being a constant, terrifying deterrent to internal revolt. The role of women in Sparta was unique among the Greeks. Because the men were always in the barracks, Spartan women managed the estates and enjoyed a level of freedom and influence that horrified their Athenian neighbors. They were trained in athletics, wrestling, and javelin throwing, based on the belief that strong mothers produce strong warriors. They were the backbone of the state, famously telling their sons to return from war either with your shield or on it. Architecture in Sparta reflected this utilitarian soul. While Athens was busy decorating its Acropolis with marble masterpieces, Sparta remained a collection of 5 unassuming villages. There were no grand theaters or ornate palaces. To an outsider, it looked like a backwater. To an insider, the lack of ostentation was a badge of honor. A Spartan's pride was not in what his city could look like, but in what his city could do. The Spartan military machine reached its zenith in the phalanx. While all Greeks used this formation, the Spartans perfected it through constant drill. They were the only professional soldiers in a world of armed amateurs. On the battlefield, they moved with a terrifying rhythmic precision, accompanied by the haunting sound of flutes rather than the chaotic shouts of other armies. They didn't need walls because no one could survive a head-on collision with their bronze-clad line. Ultimately, Sparta became a paradox, a society of equals that was the most hierarchical in Greece, and a city that loved liberty enough to die for it at Thermopylae while denying it to thousands of helots at home. They chose a path of total commitment to a single ideal, physical and moral discipline, creating a legacy that still fascinates and haunts the modern imagination. They proved that a society could be sculpted like a statue, but the cost was the total erasure of the individual.
For a Spartan boy, the 7th birthday was not a celebration, but a transformative threshold. Under the laws of Lycurgus, a child was not the property of his parents, but an asset of the state. At dawn, he would be led away from the warmth of his mother's hearth and enrolled in the agoge, a brutal state-sponsored educational furnace designed to smelt away the softness of childhood and forge the iron of a soldier. From that moment on, his family was no longer a bloodline, but a herd of peers. The barracks became his entire world, a place where the comfort of a bed was replaced by the harsh reality of the earth. To instill a sense of rugged self-reliance, the boys were forbidden from using tools to make their sleeping quarters. Instead, they were marched to the banks of the Eurotas River to harvest river reeds by hand. These jagged, brittle stalks were piled into mats that served as their only protection against the cold stone floors, a nightly reminder that a Spartan's only true comfort was his own strength. As the seasons turned, the physical discipline intensified. A Spartan youth was granted only a single garment for the entire year, a simple, coarse cloak known as the tribon. Whether in the blistering heat of the Peloponnesian summer or the bone-chilling frost of a mountain winter, he wore the same thin layer. This was not merely an act of austerity, it was a deliberate biological hardening, teaching the body to regulate its own temperature and the mind to ignore the distractions of physical discomfort. Nutritional deprivation was another calculated tool of the instructors, or paidonomos. The boys were intentionally fed meager rations, kept in a state of perpetual gnawing hunger. This wasn't to starve them, but to force them into a life of stealth. To survive, they were expected to slip into the surrounding farms and liberate food. If they were caught, they weren't punished for the theft, but for the incompetence of being discovered, beaten for the crime of being loud, clumsy, or slow. This environment created a culture of extreme observation and silence. In the barracks, the boys were taught the art of laconic speech, the practice of saying the maximum amount of meaning in the minimum number of words. To the Spartans, flowery rhetoric was a sign of a deceptive or weak mind. A true warrior spoke only when necessary, and when he did, his words were as sharp and efficient as a spear tip. This verbal discipline mirrored their military tactics: no wasted energy, no unnecessary movement. The social structure of the agoge was built on a foundation of constant institutionalized competition. Every task, from choral singing to wrestling, was a contest. Older boys were encouraged to provoke the younger ones, sparking fights that were carefully monitored by the elders. This wasn't bullying in the modern sense, it was a ritualized weeding out of fear. By the time a Spartan reached his teens, the sight of his own blood was a familiar, unremarkable occurrence. A peculiar aspect of this upbringing was the role of music and dance. While it seems contradictory to their grim reputation, Spartans were famous for their rhythmic discipline. They practiced the Pyrrhic, a war dance performed in full armor. These movements taught them how to move as a single unit, shifting their weight and striking in unison. The grace of the dancer was directly translated into the lethal precision of the phalanx, ensuring that when the equals marched, they moved with a terrifying rhythmic grace. As the boys entered their late teens, the training shifted from the physical to the psychological. The most promising among them were selected for the Crypteia, a shadowy secret service. Armed with only a knife and their wits, they were sent into the countryside to live off the land and police the helot population. This was the final exam of the agoge, a test of a young man's ability to operate in total silence and absolute lethality, ensuring that the state's internal enemies remained in a state of constant, paralyzed fear. By the age of 20, the survivors of this process emerged not as individuals, but biological extensions of the Spartan state. They were finally eligible for the syssitia, the communal mess halls where they would spend the rest of their lives eating with their brothers in arms. The agoge had succeeded in its mission. It had deleted the I and replaced it with a we. A Spartan didn't just fight for his city, he was his city, a living brick in a wall of human bronze. The legacy of the agoge is one of the most polarizing in history. To some, it was a pinnacle of civic virtue and self-sacrifice. To others, a nightmare of state-sponsored cruelty.
Yet its effectiveness was undeniable. For centuries, the mere sight of a Spartan cloak on the horizon was enough to make entire armies turn and flee. They had traded the joys of a traditional childhood for a legendary immortality, proving that while stone walls might crumble, a wall of men forged in the agoge would never break.
While the women of Athens were largely confined to the inner sanctums of the home, the gyneconis, the women of Sparta lived a life that was radical, visible, and unparalleled in the ancient world. In the eyes of the Spartan state, the strength of the city depended just as much on its daughters as its sons. From a young age, Spartan girls were not taught to weave or spin wool, tasks relegated to the helots, but were instead pushed into the bright sunlight of the public square to train their bodies for the rigors of motherhood and leadership. This physical education was a cornerstone of Spartan society. Girls participated in the same types of athletic contests as boys, competing in foot races, wrestling matches, and throwing the discus and javelin. They even engaged in the bibasis, an exhausting exercise consisting of jumping and kicking their own heels against their buttocks. The logic was purely biological and utilitarian. A weak, sedentary body would produce weak offspring. To become the mothers of men, they had to be formidable specimens of health and endurance themselves. Because Spartan men were perpetually enrolled in the military barracks until the age of 30, the domestic and economic life of the city fell entirely into the hands of the women. While their husbands were drilling in the phalanx or eating in the communal mess halls, Spartan women were the true managers of the oikos, or household estate. They didn't just manage the kitchen, they oversaw the agricultural production of the lands, directed the labor of the helots, and made critical financial decisions that kept the Spartan economy afloat. This economic power translated into significant legal standing. Unlike their sisters in other Greek city-states, Spartan women could inherit land and own property in their own right. By the 4th century BCE, it is estimated that women owned nearly 2/5 of all the land in Laconia. This level of financial independence gave them a voice that echoed through the halls of power. They were known for their biting wit and their ability to influence the political opinions of their husbands and sons, making them the silent architects of Spartan policy. The public visibility of Spartan women was a source of both fascination and scandal for the rest of Greece. They were famous for wearing the peplos, a simple garment with open side slits that allowed for freedom of movement during exercise. This earned them the nickname thigh displayers, or phenomerides, from the more conservative Athenians. However, for a Spartan woman, this exposure was not an act of immodesty, but a badge of her status as an active, vital participant in the life of the polis. This physical education for Spartan women extended beyond the physical to the intellectual and artistic. They were trained in choral poetry and dance, performing at major religious festivals like the Hyacinthia. These performances were not merely entertainment, they were civic rituals that reinforced the values of the state. Spartan women were also famously literate and articulate, trained in the same laconic style of speech as the men, which allowed them to hold their own in any debate regarding the virtue or courage of the city. The most sacred duty of a Spartan woman was her role in the cult of the warrior. Her identity was inextricably tied to the military success of her family. This was a society where a mother's grief was secondary to a mother's pride. If a son died in battle, she was expected to celebrate his courage rather than mourn his loss. This emotional hardening was the female equivalent of the agoge, a psychological conditioning that ensured the state's military resolve never wavered even in the face of catastrophe. This fierce maternal ideology is best captured in the legendary phrase, "with your shield or on it." This was the parting command given to Spartan soldiers by their mothers as they headed for war. To return with the shield meant returning victorious. To return on it meant being carried home dead after a brave stand. To return without the shield, which was often dropped in a cowardly retreat, was a disgrace that no Spartan mother would tolerate. Stories tell of mothers who personally disowned or even struck down sons who returned from a lost battle in shame. Even in death, the state honored women with a rare distinction. In a city where most graves remained unmarked to discourage vanity, only two classes of people were allowed to have their names inscribed on their tombstones: men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth. This equalized the danger of the battlefield with the danger of the birthing bed, recognizing that both were the ultimate sacrifices made for the survival and glory of Sparta. The legacy of the Spartan woman remains one of the most intriguing what-ifs of history. They were the most liberated women of antiquity, yet their freedom was strictly harnessed to the needs of a militaristic state. They were queens of their households and mistresses of their lands, living with a level of autonomy that would not be seen again for nearly 2,000 years. In the harsh, disciplined world of the Peloponnese, they were the fire that tempered the Spartan iron.
The legendary stability and military prowess of Sparta were not fueled by its own citizens' labor, but by the systemic exploitation of the helots. These were not foreign captives brought from distant lands, but a conquered population of fellow Greeks, primarily from the regions of Laconia and Messenia. While the Spartan equals spent their days in the gymnasium or the phalanx, the helots were bound to the soil, forced into a state of hereditary serfdom that provided the agricultural surplus necessary to keep the Spartan military machine fed and functional. Unlike the chattel slaves of Athens, who were bought and sold as individual property, helots were owned by the Spartan state itself. They were assigned to specific plots of land, cleri, belonging to Spartan citizens. Their primary duty was to deliver a fixed portion of their harvest, grain, wine, and oil, to their Spartan masters. This arrangement allowed the Spartan elite to hold the title of full-time soldier, but it created a society permanently divided between a small warrior caste and a massive, resentful labor force. The demographic imbalance of this system was a source of constant gnawing anxiety for the Spartan state. Historical estimates suggest that the helots outnumbered the Spartans by as many as 10 to 1. This helot threat dictated every aspect of Spartan life. It was the reason why the Spartans were so reluctant to lead their army far from home for long periods. They were essentially an occupying force in their own land, living in a state of perpetual internal siege against a population that, in the words of the historian Xenophon, would gladly eat the Spartans raw. To maintain control over such an overwhelming majority, the Spartans employed a policy of institutionalized terror. They did not rely on walls to protect their city, but on the psychological breaking of their subjects. Helots were subjected to ritualized humiliation. They were forced to wear dogskin caps and sheepskin cloaks to mark their low status, and they were reportedly forced to drink unmixed wine until they were dangerously drunk, as a lesson to Spartan youths on the ugliness of losing one's self-control. The most chilling instrument of this control was the crypteia, or secret police. Each year, the Spartan overseers, ephors, would formally declare war on the helots. This was a legal maneuver of terrifying brilliance. By declaring war, the state made it possible for any Spartan to kill a helot without the blood guilt or legal penalty usually associated with murder.
It effectively suspended the law, turning the countryside into a hunting ground where the young men of the agoge could prove their lethality. The members of the Crypteia were the elite of the Spartan youth. Armed with only a dagger and basic rations, they were sent out into the Messenian hills to hide during the day and strike at night. They targeted the strongest, most intelligent, or most influential helots, anyone who showed the potential for leadership or rebellion. By systematically pruning the tallest stalks, the Spartans ensured that the helot population remained leaderless, fragmented, and paralyzed by fear. This atmosphere of dread was punctuated by moments of extreme violence. Thucydides records a haunting incident during the Peloponnesian War where the Spartans, fearing a revolt, invited helots who claimed to have served bravely in the army to come forward for their freedom. 2,000 men were selected, crowned with garlands, and led to the temples in a victory parade. Shortly after, every single one of them vanished without a trace, presumably murdered to eliminate the most capable and ambitious members of the underclass. Despite this oppression, the helots were not passive victims. Their history is one of simmering resistance and occasional explosive rebellion. The great earthquake of 464 BCE, which leveled much of Sparta, provided the helots with an opportunity to rise. They seized the mountain stronghold of Ithome and held out for years in a desperate bid for liberty. This rebellion terrified the Spartans so deeply that they called upon the entire Greek world for help, exposing the fragile, bloody foundation upon which their orderly society was built. The relationship between the Spartan and the helot was a toxic symbiosis. The Spartan needed the helot's grain to survive, and the helot lived only because the Spartan needed his labor. This dependency made the Spartan military excellence a necessity rather than a choice. The Spartans were equals and free only because they had successfully enslaved a nation of their peers. Their legendary discipline was in many ways a response to the constant, echoing threat of the people beneath their feet. In the end, it was the loss of the helots that broke Sparta. When the Theban general Epaminondas invaded the Peloponnese in 371 BCE, his most devastating move was not a direct assault on Sparta itself, but the liberation of Messenia. By liberating the helots and helping them build the fortified city of Messene, he stripped Sparta of its labor force and its economic engine. Deprived of their slaves, the equals could no longer be afforded to be full-time soldiers, and the iron regime of Lycurgus finally crumbled into the dust of history. While Sparta was freezing its social order in iron, Athens was a city on the brink of self-destruction. In the 7th century BCE, the Athenian Golden Age was an impossible dream. The reality was a grim, widening chasm between a tiny land-owning aristocracy known as the Eupatrades, the well-born, and a desperate peasantry. The soil of Attica was thin and stony, and a single bad harvest could spell disaster for a small farmer. With no social safety net, these farmers were forced to borrow seeds and supplies from the rich, using their own bodies as collateral. This led to the horrific practice of debt slavery. If a farmer could not repay his loan, his land was seized, and he, along with his wife and children, could be sold into permanent bondage. The hills of Attica were dotted with horoi, stone pillars marking mortgaged land, serving as silent tombstones for the freedom of the poor. By 594 BCE, the tension had reached a breaking point. The city was fractured, the poor were arming themselves for a bloody revolution, and the aristocrats feared a total collapse of their privilege. In this moment of crisis, both sides turned to a man of rare integrity, Solon. He was a poet, a merchant and a philosopher who had earned a reputation for sophrosine, the Greek virtue of moderation and self-control. Rather than choosing a side, Solon was granted the extraordinary title of Archon and given a mandate to rewrite the constitution. He was the middleman of history, tasked with a mission that seemed impossible: to save the rich from their greed and the poor from their despair. Solon's first and most radical act was the Sysacthia, or the shaking off of burdens. With a single decree, he canceled all outstanding debts that had led to the enslavement of citizens. He didn't just stop future slavery, he tracked down Athenians who had been sold abroad and used public funds to buy their freedom and bring them home. It was a staggering moment of state intervention that asserted a revolutionary principle. An Athenian citizen's body was sacred and could never be owned by another. To prevent the city from sliding back into chaos, Solon removed the horoi from the fields, metaphorically and literally clearing the land. However, he was careful not to go as far as the radicals wanted. He refused to redistribute the land itself, believing that such a move would lead to a civil war that would destroy Athens. By choosing this middle path, he left the aristocrats their estates, but stripped them of their human livestock, forcing a transition from a slave-based feudalism to a more complex, wage-based economy. Solon then turned his attention to the political structure, breaking the monopoly of the well-born. He reorganized Athenian society into 4 classes based not on birth but on wealth and agricultural production. While the wealthiest still held the highest offices, even the poorest class, the Fates, were given the right to vote in the assembly and serve on juries. This was the birth of the idea that every citizen, regardless of his bank account, had a vested interest and a legal voice in the fate of the polis. The legal system was also overhauled. Solon replaced the infamously draconian laws written by his predecessor Draco, who allegedly prescribed the death penalty for even minor thefts, with a more humane and rational code. He made the laws accessible to the public, writing them on revolving wooden panels called curbes and placing them in the marketplace. For the first time, the law was not a secret whispered by aristocrats, but a public contract that could be read and debated by the people. Solon's reforms were not just about economics, they were about the human capital of Athens. He passed laws encouraging trade and crafts, requiring every father to teach his son a trade. If a father failed to do so, the son was legally absolved of the duty of supporting his father in old age. He transformed Athens from a stagnant agricultural backwater into a vibrant center of industry, laying the groundwork for the maritime empire that would later dominate the Mediterranean. Knowing that his laws would please no one entirely, Solon did something as remarkable as the laws themselves. He made the Athenians swear to uphold his code for 10 years, and then he left. He didn't want to become a tyrant. He spent the next decade traveling to Egypt and Cyprus, intentionally absenting himself so that the citizens would have to learn to govern themselves rather than relying on a single wise man. Solon did not create a perfect democracy. That would take another century and the work of leaders like Cleisthenes. But he did something more fundamental. He proved that the whim of the king or the might of the strong could be checked by the reason of the law. He taught Athens that a city is most stable when it seeks a balance between the competing interests of its people. Because of Solon, the Athenian spirit was no longer defined by the chains of debt, but by the burgeoning freedom of the mind.
By 508 BCE, the reforms of Solon had evolved into something the world had never seen: democratia, or people power.
This was not a gradual change, but a political earthquake triggered by Cleisthenes, a nobleman who broke the back of aristocratic factionalism by doing the unthinkable. He gave the power to the masses. He reorganized the entire population into 10 new tribes based on where they lived rather than their family lineage, effectively mixing the rich and the poor, the city dwellers and the farmers, into a single, unified citizenry. The heart of this new system beat on the Pnyx, a rocky, semicircular hill located a short walk from the Acropolis. This was the meeting place of the ecclesia, or assembly. While other civilizations were ruled from the shadows of palaces or the inner sanctums of temples, Athenian policy was decided under the open sky, in full view of the gods and the sea. Here, the shared identity of the polis reached its most intense and literal expression. To be an Athenian citizen was to be a legislator. 6,000 men were required for a quorum on major issues, meaning that at dawn, police officers would sweep the marketplace with a red-dyed rope, herding laggards toward the Pnyx. Once gathered, these thousands of men, from wealthy ship owners to calloused stonemasons, sat on the hard rock or wooden benches, ready to decide on everything from the price of grain to the declaration of total war. The atmosphere was a far cry from the hushed dignity of a modern parliament. It was a loud, chaotic, and often volatile affair. The proceedings began with a herald asking the famous question, "Tis agorewin bouletai," who wishes to speak? Any citizen, regardless of his status, could step forward, don a sacred myrtle wreath, and climb the bema, the stone speaker's platform. It was a terrifying test of nerves, as the speaker stood alone against the collective gaze of thousands. This was the ultimate arena of isagoria, or the equal right to speak. However, this right came with a price. The Athenian crowd was famously impatient and chthonic in its reactions. A speaker who was boring, repetitive, or sounded like a shill for a foreign power would be met with whistling, jeering, or even physical removal by the Scythian archers who acted as the assembly's guards. To survive the bema, one needed more than just a good idea. They needed the skin of a rhino and the silver tongue of an orator. To ensure that the government didn't fall back into the hands of a permanent elite, the Athenians used a process that seems bizarre to us today: sortition. Most administrative positions, including the Council of 500, boule, were filled by lottery rather than election. They believed that elections were aristocratic, as they favored the wealthy and the famous. By using a machine called a kleratorion, they ensured that any ordinary citizen might be called upon to run the city for a year. The boule acted as the assembly's steering committee, preparing the agenda for the Pnyx. Because the members changed every year and could only serve twice in a lifetime, almost every Athenian citizen could expect to hold a high-ranking government post at least once. This created a population of expert amateurs, men who understood the law because they had written it, and understood the treasury because they had managed it. One of the most unique and brutal safeguards of this democracy was ostracism. Once a year, citizens could vote to banish any individual they felt was becoming too powerful or a threat to the state. They wrote the name of the person on a shard of broken pottery called an ostrakon. If 6,000 votes were cast, the winner was exiled for 10 years. It wasn't a punishment for a crime, but a preventative measure, a political timeout, to protect the collective from the rise of a new tyrant. This system fostered an incredible sense of civic ownership. An Athenian didn't just pay taxes or follow laws, he was the state. When the city went to war, the men who had voted for the conflict on the Pnyx were the same men who put on their bronze armor and rode the triremes. This alignment of decision-making and consequence created a society of intense passion and energy, propelling Athens to the heights of the classical age. The Demokratia of Cleisthenes was imperfect. It excluded women, slaves, and foreign residents, but it established the foundational belief of Western politics, that a community is best governed when its citizens talk to each other. As the sun set over the Aegean, casting long shadows across the Pnyx, the Greeks had discovered that the most powerful tool in the world wasn't the sword of a king, but the raised hand of a free man.
Deep within the rocky earth of Attica, a discovery was made in 483 BCE that would alter the trajectory of Western civilization. At a place called Laurion, miners struck a massive, unprecedentedly rich vein of silver. Suddenly, the Athenian state found itself in possession of a staggering fortune, roughly 100 talents of silver. In the tradition of the time, the initial impulse of the assembly was to divide this windfall from the gods among the citizenry, which would have granted every man a modest but pleasant bonus. However, a visionary and shrewd politician named Themistocles saw a different future for the silver. He understood that the Persian Empire, a burgeoning superpower to the east, remained a looming existential threat. He also recognized that Athens' true potential lay not in its rocky soil, but in the wine-dark sea that surrounded it. To convince the people to forego their immediate payday, Themistocles used a bit of political sleight of hand, arguing that the silver was needed to build a fleet for a local war against the neighboring island of Aegina. The assembly was persuaded, and the silver of Laurion was diverted into a massive industrial project, the construction of 200 triremes. These were not merely boats, but the most advanced military technology of the age. The trireme was a sleek, lethal maritime predator, powered by 170 rowers arranged in 3 vertical tiers. It was designed for a single, brutal purpose: to use its bronze-sheathed prow to ram and sink enemy vessels at high speeds. This decision transformed Athens into a city of wood as much as a city of stone. The shipyards of the Piraeus became a hive of constant activity, requiring thousands of skilled shipwrights, sailmakers, and carpenters. The sheer scale of the fleet demanded a level of organization and logistics that Athens had never before attempted. The silver didn't just buy ships, it bought an industrial infrastructure that turned the city into the Mediterranean's premier naval arsenal. The geopolitical shift was instantaneous. By building this fleet, Athens effectively ended its history as a minor agricultural power and became a thalassocracy, a state whose power is derived from the sea. The trireme allowed Athens to project its influence far beyond its borders, protecting trade routes and securing its food supply by ensuring the safe passage of grain ships from the Black Sea. The silver from the hills had become the timber on the waves. This naval expansion had a profound impact on the Demokratia. In traditional land warfare, the wealthy aristocrats, who could afford horses and expensive bronze armor, held the most prestige. But a trireme required 170 rowers, mostly from the poorest class of citizens, the Thetes. Suddenly, the security and glory of the state rested on the muscles and sweat of the common man. Because they provided the engine for the fleet, the Thetes gained a new, undeniable political leverage, further radicalizing Athenian democracy. The training of the fleet was as rigorous as any Spartan drill. Rowing a trireme required perfect synchronization. A single oar out of time could foul the entire bank. The Athenians became the most disciplined mariners in the world, practicing complex maneuvers like the dikapleus, sailing through the enemy line to snap their oars, or the kaiklos, a defensive circle. The silver of Laurion had essentially funded a permanent, professional standing navy in an era of part-time soldiers.
The true test of Themistocles' gamble came just 3 years later, in 480 BCE, when the Persian king Xerxes launched a massive invasion of Greece. While the Spartans held the mountain pass at Thermopylae, it was the Athenian fleet that provided the decisive blow. At the Battle of Salamis, the 200 triremes outmaneuvered the larger, more cumbersome Persian fleet in the narrow straits. Without a navy to protect his supply lines, Xerxes was forced to retreat, saving Greece from becoming a Persian province. Following the Persian Wars, the silver-funded fleet became the foundation of the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states led by Athens. What began as a defensive pact quickly evolved into an Athenian empire. The contributions from other cities were used to maintain the fleet and, famously, to rebuild the Acropolis in the shimmering marble we see today. The Parthenon itself can be viewed as a monument to the silver of Laurion and the naval power it birthed. The legacy of the Laurian silver is a reminder of how a single resource, guided by visionary leadership, can redefine a nation. Athens went into the mines as a group of divided farmers and came out as a unified naval superpower that would dominate the Mediterranean for decades. The silver didn't just buy ships, it bought the time and security necessary for the golden age of Pericles to flourish, ensuring that Athenian art, philosophy, and politics would echo forever.
The Athenians were a people haunted by the memory of tyrants. They understood that even the most robust democracy could be dismantled from within by a single charismatic leader who grew too popular, too wealthy, or too ambitious. To prevent the shared identity of the polis from being eclipsed by a single ego, they institutionalized a radical political timeout known as ostracism. This was not a trial for a crime, but a preventative strike, a way for the collective to say, "You are becoming too big for this city." Once a year, during the 6th Prytany, or administrative month, the assembly met to decide whether an ostracism should be held. No names were mentioned at this stage. The question was simply whether the state felt at risk. If the people voted yes, a formal day of reckoning was set several weeks later. This period allowed the city to simmer with debate as rival factions campaigned in the shadows and citizens weighed the influence of their most prominent leaders. On the day of the vote, the process was remarkably tactile and democratic. Citizens did not use expensive papyrus. Instead, they used ostraca, the broken shards of pottery that littered every Greek household. In an age before recycling, these fragments were the scrap paper of antiquity. Each citizen would scratch the name of the man he wished to see banished onto his shard. This made the act of voting a physical, gritty experience, the literal scratching of a name into stone. The voting took place in the agora, the heart of public life. To ensure the result reflected a genuine consensus, a quorum of 6,000 votes was required. If the threshold was met, the man whose name appeared on the most shards was declared the winner. He was given 10 days to settle his affairs before being banished from Attica for a full decade. It was a cold, efficient surgery performed by the many upon the one. Unlike modern exile, ostracism was not intended to ruin a man's life or family. The victim did not lose his property, nor did his family lose their citizenship or status. His wealth remained intact, waiting for him upon his return. This distinction was crucial. It signaled that the banishment was not a punishment for evil, but a temporary removal for the sake of balance. It was the political equivalent of pruning a tree so that the other branches might have room to breathe. The psychology of the ostrakon was deeply tied to the Greek concept of hubris.
The Athenians believed that when a man's power grew too great, he risked offending the gods and destabilizing the natural order. By casting a shard against a leader, a citizen was performing a ritual of humility on behalf of the state. It was a reminder to the elite that their power was a gift from the people, one that could be revoked at any moment by a simple piece of broken clay. However, the system was far from perfect and was often ripe for manipulation. Political factions would sometimes pre-prepare hundreds of ostraca with a rival's name already inscribed, handing them out to illiterate or undecided voters like modern campaign flyers. Archaeology has uncovered caches of identical shards, proving that even in the 5th century BCE, ballot stuffing and organized smear campaigns were part of the democratic process. There are famous, almost poetic stories of the process in action. One tells of Aristides the Just, a statesman so respected for his virtue that he became an annoyance. An illiterate farmer, not recognizing Aristides, reportedly asked the statesman to write the name Aristides on his shard for him. When Aristides asked what the man had against him, the farmer replied, "Nothing. I don't even know him. I'm just tired of hearing everyone call him the Just." Aristides, ever the man of integrity, silently wrote his own name and handed it back. Ostracism eventually fell out of favor toward the end of the 5th century BCE. The last man to be ostracized was a minor politician named Hyperbolus. In a strange twist, the two most powerful men in the city, Alcibiades and Nicias, realized they were both at risk of being banished. They joined their factions together to target Hyperbolus instead, essentially breaking the system. The Athenians were so disgusted by this cynical manipulation of a sacred ritual that they never used the process again.
Unlike the modern religions of the book, the spiritual life of ancient Greece was not anchored in a single, unchanging text or a rigid set of moral commandments. There was no Bible, no Torah, and no Quran to dictate the will of the heavens. Instead, Greek religion was a living, breathing, and often chaotic relationship with the Olympians, a family of powerful, immortal, and deeply unpredictable deities who resided atop the cloud-shrouded peaks of Mount Olympus. To the Greeks, these gods were not distant, perfect beings. They were superhuman neighbors who occupied the same world and shared the same volatile emotions as humanity. This relationship was based on the principle of do ut des, I give so that you might give. It was a cosmic negotiation. The gods controlled the rain, the sea, the harvest, and the health of the family, but their favor was never guaranteed. One did not believe in Zeus so much as one acknowledged his power and sought to stay on his good side. If a storm wrecked a ship, it wasn't necessarily a punishment for a moral failing. It might simply be that Poseidon was having a bad day, or that the captain had forgotten to pour a proper libation before setting sail. At the heart of this negotiation was the sacrifice. In every home and city square, altars were the primary points of contact with the divine. The most significant act of worship was the animal sacrifice, usually a bull, goat, or pig. In a brilliant bit of mythic loophole finding, the Greeks believed the gods primarily craved the fragrant smoke of the burning fat and bones, while the worshippers themselves got to feast on the roasted meat. This ritual was a communal meal that bound the human and divine worlds together, ensuring that for a moment the neighbors were satisfied. Day-to-day life was punctuated by smaller, constant gestures of respect known as libations. Before a man drank wine at a symposium or a family shared a meal, a few drops were poured onto the earth for the gods. These were tiny bribes intended to keep the household's relationship with the divine on steady ground. To ignore these rituals was not just impious, it was considered dangerous.
A house that never poured a libation was a house inviting a sudden bolt of lightning or a mysterious blight on the garden. The landscape itself was saturated with the divine. Every spring had a nymph, every grove had a dryad, and every mountain peak belonged to a specific god. This created a world where the supernatural was simply another layer of the natural. When a Greek walked through the woods, they weren't just in nature, they were in a sanctuary. This encouraged a deep ritualistic respect for the environment, as any spring or tree could be the sacred property of an easily offended deity. The greatest fear in this relationship was hubris, the sin of excessive pride or overstepping one's place. The Greeks believed that the boundary between humans and gods was thin but absolute. To claim you were more beautiful than Aphrodite, faster than Hermes, or wiser than Athena was to invite Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. Hubris was the ultimate neighborly offense. It was the act of a mortal trying to move into the house on the hill. Most Greek tragedies were essentially cautionary tales about the horrific price of forgetting that you are merely human. Festivals were the block parties of the Greek religious world. Events like the Great Dionysia or the Panathenea were massive state-funded celebrations that turned the city into a theater of the divine. These were not somber, quiet affairs. They involved parades, athletic competitions, musical performances, and heavy drinking. The gods, the Greeks believed, enjoyed a good show as much as anyone else. By entertaining the gods, the city ensured its collective security for another year. While the Olympians were the celebrities of the religion, much of the actual spiritual work happened in the dark, through oracles. If the negotiation with the gods became too confusing, one traveled to sites like Delphi. Here the Pythia, a priestess in a trance, would deliver the cryptic words of Apollo. These prophecies were rarely clear, often acting as mirrors for the seeker's own intentions. The gods didn't give straight answers, they gave riddles that forced humans to use their own reason to navigate the divine will. For those seeking a more personal connection, there were the mystery cults, such as the ones at Eleusis. Unlike the public, civic religion of the city, these cults were private and secretive. They promised their initiates a better lot in the afterlife, a concept that the standard Olympian religion, which viewed the underworld as a gray, boring place for everyone, largely ignored. These mysteries provided an emotional depth to the Greeks' relationship with the divine, offering a glimmer of hope beyond the negotiation of earthly life. In the end, Greek religion was a brilliant reflection of the Mediterranean world, beautiful, vibrant, and potentially lethal. It was a system that encouraged humans to be excellent, to build great temples, and to write magnificent plays, all while keeping them grounded by the knowledge of their own mortality. By treating the gods as unpredictable neighbors, the Greeks developed a worldview that was both deeply spiritual and profoundly practical, a constant dance on the sun-drenched hills between human ambition and divine whim.
In the ancient mind, the center of the universe was not a throne or a palace, but a jagged limestone outcrop on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, known as Delphi. The Greeks called it the omphalos, or the navel of the world, believing it was the exact spot where two eagles, released from Zeus from opposite ends of the earth, finally met. This was the sanctuary of Apollo, the god of light, music, and prophecy, and it served as the ultimate destination for anyone, from a mud-splattered farmer to a gold-clad emperor seeking a glimpse through the veil of time. The process of seeking the truth was a grueling pilgrimage. Travelers would climb the sacred way, winding past treasure houses filled with the spoils of war, until they reached the great temple of Apollo. To consult the god, one had to pay a tax, the pelanos, offer a goat for sacrifice, and wait for their turn.
The atmosphere was thick with tension and the smell of roasting fat, as the fate of entire nations hung on what was about to happen in the Aegean, the restricted inner sanctum of the temple. At the heart of the ritual was the Pythia, a local woman chosen for her piety rather than her social status. To prepare, she would bathe in the nearby Castalian spring and drink from the sacred waters of the Casotis. She then took her place in the Aegean, seated upon a high bronze tripod. Legend says she sat directly over a chasm in the earth, from which emanated pneuma, mysterious geological vapors that induced a state of divine trance, allowing her mind to be occupied by Apollo himself. Modern geological surveys have revealed that the temple sits at the intersection of two major fault lines, where ethylene gas, a known hallucinogen, likely leaked from the limestone. As the Pythia inhaled these fumes, her body would convulse and her voice would change. She would mutter rhythmic, incoherent words that were far removed from human speech. To the Greeks, this was not a medical condition, but a divine madness, the literal sound of a god speaking through a human vessel. Standing nearby were the prophetae, the priests of the temple, who acted as the essential middlemen of the divine. It was their job to listen to the Pythia's wild utterances and translate them into dactylic hexameter, the same rhythmic verse used by Homer. However, the priests were careful never to provide a straight answer. The prophecies were delivered as riddles or oracles, designed to be so ambiguous that they were technically always correct, regardless of the outcome. The most famous example of this divine ambiguity occurred when King Croesus of Lydia asked if he should invade Persia. The oracle replied that if he crossed the river Halys, a great empire would fall. Encouraged, Croesus marched to war, only to see his own empire destroyed. The oracle hadn't lied. It had merely allowed the king's own hubris to dictate his interpretation. This taught the Greeks a vital lesson. The gods provide the data, but humans must provide the wisdom to understand it. The influence of the oracle was not limited to personal fortunes. It was the primary driver of Greek colonization. Before a city-state would send out a group of settlers to find a new home in Italy or the Black Sea, they would consult the Pythia for the best location. If the colony failed, the settlers were blamed for misinterpreting the gods' directions. In this way, Delphi acted as a central intelligence agency for the Greek world, coordinating expansion and preventing internal conflicts between rival cities. The oracle also functioned as a supreme court and a moral compass. Cities would bring their legal disputes to Apollo, and the Pythia's word could end a civil war or validate a new constitution. Even the Spartans, famous for their self-reliance, would not march to war without the god's blessing. This gave the priests of Delphi immense soft power, as they could subtly guide the politics of all Greece through the specific phrasing of their riddles. Above the entrance to the temple were two inscriptions that summarized the Delphic philosophy: "Know thyself" and "Nothing in excess." These were warnings to those who came seeking answers. The oracle wasn't there to tell you your future as if it were unchangeable. It was there to force you to examine your own motives and limits. The riddle was a mirror, reflecting the heart of the seeker back at them before they made a choice that could change the world. The silence eventually fell over Delphi in the 4th century CE, as the Roman Empire converted to Christianity and the old gods were cast out. The last recorded oracle was a haunting message sent to the Emperor Julian. "Tell the king, the hall has fallen to the ground. Apollo no longer has his cell, nor the laurel of prophecy, nor the babbling spring." Though the fumes have dissipated and the Pythia is gone, The stones of Delphi remain, a silent monument to an age when humanity believed that if you climbed high enough, you could hear the heartbeat of the divine. Every 4 years, the constant bickering and bloodshed of the Greek city-states were forced into a sudden divine intermission. As the summer sun reached its zenith, the Ekacheria, or sacred truce, was proclaimed by heralds traveling to every corner of the Greek world. From the rugged mountains of Macedon to the sun-soaked colonies of Sicily, the clatter of spears was silenced. This was not merely a polite suggestion, it was a religious mandate. Roads that were once dangerous war zones became safe highways for pilgrims and athletes, all converging on the fertile, olive-fringed valley of Olympia. Life as the Greeks knew it, the politics of the Pnyx, the drills of the agoge, the commerce of the agora, slowed to a crawl. The focus of the entire Hellenic world shifted to a single, sacred sanctuary in the Peloponnese dedicated to Zeus. This was the Olympic spirit in its rawest form, a belief that human excellence, arete, was the highest form of worship. For 5 days, the only war permitted was the bloodless conflict of the stadium, where men strove to prove that they had transcended the limitations of the flesh. The centerpiece of the athletic program was the pentathlon, a grueling test of versatility that crowned the ultimate all-around athlete. A competitor had to master 5 distinct disciplines: the long jump, the javelin throw, the discus, the foot race, and wrestling. To win the pentathlon was to be seen as the physical ideal, a man who possessed the perfect balance of speed, strength, and grace. It was a rejection of specialization in favor of the complete man, a philosophy that mirrored the Greek desire for balance in all things. In the palaestra, the atmosphere turned visceral as the combat sports began. Wrestling, and the even more brutal pankration, a no-holds-barred mixture of boxing and grappling, were the crowd favorites. These weren't mere displays of brawn, they were chess matches of the body. The athletes, coated in olive oil and fine sand, struggled in the heat until one surrendered or was rendered unconscious. In these moments, the boundary between human and animal blurred, yet the Greeks viewed the struggle as a divine refinement of the soul. Nothing, however, matched the thundering spectacle of the chariot races held in the hippodrome. 4-horse teams, lashed by desperate drivers, tore round a precarious track at breakneck speeds. It was the most dangerous and expensive event in the games, where crashes were frequent and often fatal. Interestingly, the olive wreath was not awarded to the driver, but to the owner of the horses. This allowed even those who didn't compete physically, including women like the Spartan princess Kiniska, to claim an Olympic victory. To the Greeks, winning at Olympia was not about the prize, a simple wreath of wild olive leaves cut from a sacred tree, but about the status it conferred. A victor was seen as Theophilos, or beloved by the gods. The victory was interpreted as divine proof that the gods had looked upon the athlete and found him worthy. It was the closest a mortal could get to immortality while still breathing, a flash of celestial light that elevated a man above the mundane world of debt and decay. When a victor returned to his home city-state, the reception was nothing short of messianic. He was no longer just a citizen, he was a living talisman of the city's favor with the heavens. In some famous instances, the city would not allow their hero to enter through a common gate. Instead, they would tear down a section of the city walls to create a unique entrance. The logic was as poetic as it was practical. A city that produced such a man had no need for stone walls to protect it. The rewards for victory were lifelong and lavish. In Athens, an Olympic victor was granted free meals for life in the Parthenon, the city's town hall, and front-row seats at all festivals and theatrical performances. Poets like Pindar were commissioned to write Epinetian odes, victory songs that linked the athlete's family tree to the ancient heroes and gods, ensuring that his name would be sung in the halls of the polis for generations to come. Beyond the individual glory, the games served as the ultimate family reunion for the Greeks. In the shadow of the massive temple of Zeus, which housed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the giant gold and ivory statue of Zeus, Greeks from rival cities shared meals, listened to philosophers, and watched the same dramas. It was a reminder that despite their constant wars, they shared one language, one religion, and one standard of excellence. The stadium was the only place where a Spartan and an Athenian could stand together in awe of single human achievement. The Olympic flame eventually flickered out in the 4th century CE, silenced by the same Roman decrees that closed the oracle at Delphi. But for over 1,000 years, the Games had provided a heartbeat for Greek civilization. They taught the world that the pursuit of greatness is a sacred act, and that for a few days every 4 years, humanity could set aside the sword for the olive branch, looking toward the sun-drenched stadium to see what was possible when men competed for the gods.
In the heart of the Athenian spring, the city underwent a metamorphosis. The bustling business of the Piraeus and the political squabbles of the Pnyx were suspended for the great Dionysia, a massive festival dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and theater. For several days, the entire population, thousands of citizens, residents, and visitors, descended upon the theater of Dionysus on the south slope of the Acropolis. This was not merely leisure, it was a religious and civic duty, a time when the city stared into the mirror of the stage to examine its own conscience. The theater itself was a marvel of acoustic engineering, a vast stone semicircle carved into the hillside. Because the audiences could number over 15,000, the spectacle had to be larger than life. Actors wore oversized masks made of stiffened linen or wood, featuring exaggerated expressions and wide mouth holes designed to act as resonators. These masks allowed a single actor to play multiple roles, switching from a grieving queen to a vengeful god with a simple change of headgear, and ensured that even the spectator in the very last row could distinguish between joy and despair. The primary genre of the festival was tragedy, a word derived from tragodia, or goat song. These plays did not shy away from the darkest corners of the human condition. They tackled themes of incest, matricide, hubris, and the agonizing weight of fate. By watching heroes like Oedipus or Antigone fall from great heights, the audience was forced to confront the fragility of their own lives. These stories were often set in the distant past, but they spoke directly to the anxieties of the present, questioning the morality of war and the limits of human law. Contrastively, the old comedy of playwrights like Aristophanes served as the city's safety valve. While tragedies dealt with myths, comedies were fiercely contemporary and often bitingly political. Actors in comedies wore grotesque, padded costumes and engaged in ribald humor that spared no one. They openly mocked the city's generals, philosophers like Socrates, and even the gods themselves. This freedom of the theater was a vital component of democracy, allowing the people to laugh at the very leaders they had voted into power. At the heart of the theatrical experience was the chorus. This group of 12 to 15 performers danced and sang in the orchestra, the circular space between the actors and the audience.
The chorus represented the voice of the community, reacting to the unfolding drama with the same fear, confusion, or hope as the spectators. They provided the moral bridge between the epic actions of the heroes and the everyday reality of the Athenian citizen, reminding the audience that the lessons of the stage were intended for them. The ultimate goal of these performances was catharsis. The philosopher Aristotle described this as a cleansing or purgation of the spirit through the shared experience of pity and fear. By watching a tragic hero suffer, the audience could release their own pent-up emotions in a safe, communal environment. They left the theater not depressed, but lighter, having processed their collective traumas and emerged with a clearer understanding of their place in the universe. The festival was also a fierce competition. 3 playwrights were chosen to present a trilogy of tragedies, followed by a satyr play, a lewd, mythic burlesque. A panel of judges chosen by lot from the 10 tribes of Athens would vote on the winner. To win the Dionysia was a mark of supreme prestige, not just for the playwright, but the choregos, the wealthy citizen who had funded the production as a form of liturgy or public service. Theater was inherently political. Plays were performed in the city Dionysia just before the sailing season began, meaning the audience included ambassadors and allies from across the Greek world. Athens used the stage to project its cultural superiority and to debate its imperial policies. A play like Euripides' The Trojan Women, written during the Peloponnesian War, served as a haunting critique of the cruelty of conquest, forcing the very men who rowed the warships to witness the human cost of their victories. The physical structure of the theater reflected the hierarchy and values of the polis. The front rows of stone thrones, the prohedria, were reserved for the priests of Dionysus and honored officials, while the rest of the citizens sat according to their tribes. Even the Theoric Fund was established to pay for the tickets of the poorest citizens, ensuring that the entire body politic could participate in this spiritual and intellectual sharpening. Though the great Dionysia eventually faded, the blueprint of Western drama was etched forever in those stone hillsides. The Greeks had discovered that the theater was more than an escape. It was a laboratory for empathy. By gathering in the shadow of the Acropolis to weep and laugh together, they turned the noise of the modern world into the timeless harmony of the human story, proving that through art, a community can find the strength to face its own darkness. To understand the Greek world, one must step off the dusty, shouting streets of the agora and cross the threshold into the oikos. To a Greek, the oikos was far more than a house. It was the fundamental unit of civilization, encompassing the family, the property, the slaves, and the ancestral spirits. Architecturally, the Greek home was an introverted structure, presenting blank, windowless walls to the street to shield the family from the noise, dust, and prying eyes of the public. Life did not look outward toward the city, but inward toward the heart of the home. The heartbeat of the oikos was the central courtyard. This open-air space was the lungs of the house, allowing sunlight and fresh air to filter into the surrounding rooms. It was a multifunctional arena where the boundaries of the household blurred. Here, children played with ceramic hoops and knuckle bones, slaves ground grain or washed clothes, and the family's domestic altar stood as a reminder that the gods were also residents of the home. In the heat of the summer, the courtyard was a cool refuge. In the winter, it was where the family gathered to catch the pale Mediterranean sun. The Greek home was a strictly gendered landscape. Men were essentially public animals, spending their daylight hours in the assembly, the gymnasium, or the marketplace. For a citizen, the house was primarily a place to sleep and eat. Consequently, the public-facing part of the house was the andron, or the men's dining room. This was the only room where male guests were permitted. Adorned with the finest mosaics and couches, the andron was the site of the symposium, where men drank and debated politics, safely separated from the private life of the rest of the family. While the men occupied the public spheres, the women were the undisputed masters of the interior. The gynaikon, or women's quarters, was typically located on the second floor or in the most secluded part of the house, away from the street and the andron. This was the domain of the despoina, the mistress of the house. Though Athenian law gave women few public rights, within the walls of the oikos their authority was absolute. They managed the complex logistics of a self-sustaining household, a task that required the skills of an accountant, a manager, and a master craftswoman. The primary labor of the gynaikon was the production of textiles. Weaving was not just a hobby, it was a vital economic necessity. Every garment the family wore, from the finest linen chiton to the heaviest wool himaiton, was produced by the women of the house. The rhythmic clack-clack of the loom was the soundtrack of the Greek home. A woman's virtue and skill were often measured by the quality of her weaving, an art form that allowed her to weave the family's history and status into the very fabric of their lives. Beyond the loom, the mistress of the house managed the pantry and storerooms. In an age without refrigeration, this was a high-stakes job. She had to oversee the preservation of olives, the fermentation of wine, and the drying of figs and grains to ensure the family survived the winter. She held the keys to the store chests, and her ability to ration and distribute resources dictated the health and wealth of the oikos. This domestic power was the silent engine of Greek society, providing the stability that allowed men to focus on the volatile world of politics. The oikos was also a site of constant labor for the enslaved members of the household. Slaves were integrated into the daily rhythm of the family, often sleeping in small rooms near the kitchen or the work areas. They were responsible for the heavy lifting, fetching water from public fountains, cooking over charcoal braziers, and cleaning. While their lives were defined by a lack of freedom, their proximity to the family led to complex relationships that varied from brutal exploitation to a strange paternalistic inclusion in family rituals. Education within the home was informal but rigorous. While boys would eventually be sent to school or the gymnasium, their early years were spent in the gynaikon, under the tutelage of their mothers and nurses. They learned the myths of the gods, the history of their ancestors, and the fundamental values of sophrosine, moderation. For girls, the oikos was their only school, where they apprenticed under their mothers to learn the household arts they would one day use to manage their own homes. The sanctity of the oikos was protected by Hestia, the goddess of the hearth. The hearth fire was never allowed to go out, symbolizing the continuity and life force of the family. When a new bride entered the home, she was led to the hearth to be formally introduced to the family's ancestors. The house was not just a shelter, it was a sacred space, a fortress of privacy in a world that was increasingly loud, democratic, and demanding. Ultimately, the Greek home was a place of profound balance. It provided a quiet counterpoint to the high-stakes drama of the Acropolis and the stadium. Within these mud-brick walls, under the watchful eye of the mistress and the glow of the hearth, the individual was nurtured and the culture was preserved. The oikos was the hidden foundation of the Greek miracle, proving that the strength of a civilization is built not just on its public monuments, but on the quiet, disciplined power of its private lives.
The agora was far more than a simple marketplace. It was the open-air nervous system of the Greek city-state.
Located at the foot of the Acropolis, this sprawling plaza was where the shared identity of the citizen was practiced and refined through daily friction. From dawn until the sun dipped behind the hills, the agora was a cacophony of human activity. It was a place where the scent of roasting meat mingled with the pungency of salt fish and the sweetness of sun-ripened figs, creating a sensory overload that signaled the very essence of urban life. Commerce was the most immediate layer of the agora's identity. The space was divided into specialized sections known as circles, where vendors hawked their specific wares. In one corner, the garlic sellers shouted their prices over the honey merchants, while in another, the fishmongers displayed silver-scaled catches from the Aegean. This was high-stakes haggling. Prices weren't fixed, and a man's wit was as much a currency as the silver tetradrachms in his pouch. The market was the equalizer, where the aristocrat and the laborer argued over the cost of a head of cabbage. Defining the edges of this chaos were the stoas, elegant, long, shaded walkways supported by rows of columns. These structures were the architectural geniuses of the agora, providing a cool refuge from the relentless Mediterranean sun and a dry shelter during winter rains. While the center of the square was for buying and selling, the stoas were for being. They were the city's living rooms, where men gathered to sit on stone benches, escape the dust, and engage in the primary Athenian pastime, conversation. It was under these stoas that Western philosophy was born and debated. Philosophers like Socrates didn't hide in ivory towers. They stood in the shade of the Stoa Basilias, accosting passers-by with uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, virtue, and reality. Later, Zeno of Citium would teach his followers in the Stoa Poikile, the painted Stoa, leading to his school being named Stoicism. To the Greeks, the marketplace was the perfect laboratory for the mind, as the truth was best found through the elenchus, the back and forth of public argument. The agora was also the city's clearinghouse for information. In an age before newspapers or radio, news traveled at the speed of a returning merchant ship. If a colony in Sicily had been attacked, or if a new silver vein had been found in Thrace, the news arrived at the agora first. Men would gather around the monument of the eponymous heroes, where official decrees and public notices were posted on wooden tablets. Here, the low gossip of the street met the high politics of the state, and a man's reputation could be made or broken by a single afternoon's rumors. Beyond trade and talk, the agora was the site of the city's administrative machinery. Nestled among the stalls were buildings like the Boulaterion, the Council House, and the Tholos, the headquarters of the Executive Committee. The proximity of these government buildings to the fish sellers was intentional. It reminded the politicians that they were part of the people, and it allowed the people to keep a watchful, often cynical eye on their leaders. In the agora, power was never allowed to become distant or mysterious. The space was also deeply sacred. Boundary stones, or horoi, marked the edges of the square, and anyone with unclean hands, such as those who had committed a crime or avoided military service, was religiously barred from entering. Altars to various gods, like the altar of the 12 gods, served as mile zero, the point from which all distances in the region were measured. The agora was a consecrated ground, where the act of fair trade and honest speech was viewed as a form of worship to Zeus Agaroios, the protector of the assembly. Socially, the agora was a masculine space, but it was not devoid of others. While respectable women remained in the oikos, the square was filled with female vendors, flower girls, and metic or foreign merchants. Slaves were everywhere, running errands for their masters or carrying heavy loads of imported pottery. The agora was a microcosm of the entire Mediterranean world,
a place where different social classes and ethnicities collided, creating a vibrant, often messy diversity that fueled the city's intellectual energy. The Agora also hosted the darker side of democracy. Near the edges of the square lay the state prison, where men like Socrates would eventually face the consequences of their public questioning. It was also where the ostracism votes were counted. The very place that celebrated the freedom of speech was also the place that could take it away. This tension made the Agora a high-stakes arena. To walk its stones was to participate in a grand, dangerous experiment in human cooperation. Ultimately, the Agora proved that the heart of a civilization is not its military might or its wealth, but its capacity for public life. It was the noise of the modern world of its time, a place of shouting, arguing, laughing, and thinking. By gathering in the open air to trade both salt fish and high philosophy, the Greeks created a template for the city that we still use today. The Agora was the proof that when humans meet in the middle, they don't just create a market, they create a world.
After the sun had set and the heavy evening meal, daipnon, was cleared away, the private world of the wealthy Greek home transformed into a stage for the symposion. Literally meaning drinking together, the symposion was far more than a simple party. It was a highly ritualized social institution designed to bond the male elite of the polis. As the slaves washed the floors and brought in the small tables, the guests prepared for a night of intellectual play, where the goal was not intoxication, but the cultivation of the spirit and the mind. The setting for this event was the andron, the men's room, which was the most decorated space in the oikos. Guests did not sit in chairs, they reclined on high, cushioned couches called klinai, usually arranged in a U-shape around the room so that every participant could see and hear everyone else. Reclining was a mark of status, a posture of leisure that signaled one had transcended the world of manual labor. Propped up on their left elbows, the men faced the center of the room, ready for a night of structured intimacy. The governor of the evening was the symposiarch, a guest chosen by lot or consensus to lead the party. It was his duty to decide the ratio of the wine. The Greeks considered drinking unmixed wine to be barbaric and dangerous, a path to madness. Instead, the wine was poured into a massive, ornate bowl called a crater, where it was diluted with water, often 3 parts water to 1 part wine. This ensured that the guests remained articulate and witty, keeping them in that perfect state of relaxed focus necessary for high-level debate. The evening began with formal libations, 3 pours of wine to honor the gods, particularly Dionysus, and the singing of a paean, a hymn of praise. Once the rituals were satisfied, the play began. One of the most popular games was kottabos, which required guests to flick the dregs of their wine at a bronze target in the center of the room. It was a test of dexterity and poise, proving that even while drinking, a Greek man maintained control over his physical movements. Music was the constant heartbeat of the symposion. Guests took turns holding a branch of myrtle and singing skolia, or drinking songs, accompanied by the aulos, a double-piped reed instrument, or the lyre. Often, professional female musicians and dancers were brought in to provide entertainment, but the primary focus remained on the guests' own contributions. Every man was expected to be a performer, a poet, and a wit, contributing to the collective harmony of the evening. As the wine flowed and the music softened, the conversation turned toward philosophy and dialectic. This was the true purpose of the symposion, the competitive exchange of ideas. Guests might debate the nature of love, the definition of justice,
or the best way to govern a city. These were not dry lectures, but lively, often humorous sparring matches. Plato's famous Symposium is a literary immortalization of such a night, where figures like Socrates and Aristophanes took turns attempting to define the essence of eros. The Symposion was a laboratory for eunomia, or good order. By following the rules of the symposiarch and maintaining their composure, the men practiced the self-restraint required of a citizen in the assembly. To overdrink and become violent or incoherent was to fail the social test. The ability to stay sharp and eloquent while the crater was being refilled was the ultimate mark of a gentleman, kalos kagatos, proving that his reason was stronger than his appetite. Humor was a vital component of the night. Guests told riddles, shared anecdotes, and engaged in parody, mocking the high-flown language of epic poets or the pomposity of local politicians. This low gossip served as a social glue, reinforcing the shared values and inside jokes of the aristocratic class. In the andron, the boundaries of the polis were reinforced. You knew who your friends were by the way they laughed at your jokes and challenged your logic. As the night reached its end, the party often spilled out into the streets in a komos, a rowdy musical procession through the city. Crowned with ivy wreaths and carrying torches, the komasts would sing their way home, signaling to the sleeping city that the elite had successfully completed their rituals. While it could sometimes border on disorderly, the komos was the final release of energy, the closing movement of the night's structured performance. The legacy of the Symposion is found in the very concept of academic or intellectual community. It taught the Greeks that the mind is a muscle that must be exercised in the company of others. By turning a drinking party into a forum for philosophy and art, they created a culture where the pursuit of truth was not a solitary chore, but a joyful communal celebration. The wine might have been diluted, but the ideas born in those smoke-filled rooms would go on to intoxicate the Western mind for 2,000 years.
After the sun had set and the heavy evening meal, deipnon, was cleared away, the private world of the wealthy Greek home transformed into a stage for the Symposion. Literally meaning drinking together, the Symposion was far more than a simple party. It was a highly ritualized social institution designed to bond the male elite of the polis. As the slaves washed the floors and brought in the small tables, the guests prepared for a night of intellectual play, where the goal was not intoxication, but the cultivation of the spirit and the mind. The setting for this event was the andron, the men's room, which was the most decorated space in the oikos. Guests did not sit in chairs, they reclined on high, cushioned couches called klinai, usually arranged in a U-shape around the room so that every participant could see and hear everyone else. Reclining was a mark of status, a posture of leisure that signaled one had transcended the world of manual labor. Propped up on their left elbows, the men faced the center of the room, ready for a night of structured intimacy. The governor of the evening was the symposiarch, a guest chosen by lot or consensus to lead the party. It was his duty to decide the ratio of the wine. The Greeks considered drinking unmixed wine to be barbaric and dangerous, a path to madness. Instead, the wine was poured into a massive, ornate bowl called a crater, where it was diluted with water, often 3 parts water to 1 part wine. This ensured that the guests remained articulate and witty,
keeping them in that perfect state of relaxed focus necessary for high-level debate. The evening began with formal libations, 3 pours of wine to honor the gods, particularly Dionysus, and the singing of a paean, a hymn of praise. Once the rituals were satisfied, the play began. One of the most popular games was kottabos, which required guests to flick the dregs of their wine at a bronze target in the center of the room. It was a test of dexterity and poise, proving that even while drinking, a Greek man maintained control over his physical movements. Music was the constant heartbeat of the symposion. Guests took turns holding a branch of myrtle and singing scholia, or drinking songs, accompanied by the aulos, a double-piped reed instrument, or the lyre. Often, professional female musicians and dancers were brought in to provide entertainment, but the primary focus remained on the guests' own contributions. Every man was expected to be a performer, a poet, and a wit, contributing to the collective harmony of the evening. As the wine flowed and the music softened, the conversation turned toward philosophy and dialectic. This was the true purpose of the symposion, the competitive exchange of ideas. Guests might debate the nature of love, the definition of justice, or the best way to govern a city. These were not dry lectures, but lively, often humorous sparring matches. Plato's famous Symposium is a literary immortalization of such a night, where figures like Socrates and Aristophanes took turns attempting to define the essence of eros. The symposium was a laboratory for eunomia, or good order. By following the rules of the symposiarch and maintaining their composure, the men practiced the self-restraint required of a citizen in the assembly. To overdrink and become violent or incoherent was to fail the social test. The ability to stay sharp and eloquent while the crater was being refilled was the ultimate mark of a gentleman, kalos kagathos, proving that his reason was stronger than his appetite. Humor was a vital component of the night. Guests told riddles, shared anecdotes, and engaged in parody, mocking the high-flown language of epic poets or the pomposity of local politicians. This low gossip served as a social glue, reinforcing the shared values and inside jokes of the aristocratic class. In the andron, the boundaries of the polis were reinforced. You knew who your friends were by the way they laughed at your jokes and challenged your logic. As the night reached its end, the party often spilled out into the streets in a komos, a rowdy musical procession through the city. Crowned with ivy wreaths and carrying torches, the komasts would sing their way home, signaling to the sleeping city that the elite had successfully completed their rituals. While it could sometimes border on disorderly, the komos was the final release of energy, the closing movement of the night's structured performance. The legacy of the symposium is found in the very concept of academic or intellectual community. It taught the Greeks that the mind is a muscle that must be exercised in the company of others. By turning a drinking party into a forum for philosophy and art, they created a culture where the pursuit of truth was not a solitary chore, but a joyful, communal celebration. The wine might have been diluted, but the ideas born in those smoke-filled rooms would go on to intoxicate the Western mind for 2,000 years.
The invasion of 490 BCE was not merely a border dispute, it was an existential collision between two incompatible worldviews. To the east lay the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a colossal superpower that viewed the world as a collection of subjects to be governed by the King of Kings, Darius I. To the west lay the tiny, fractious Greek city-states, specifically Athens, which had recently tasted the headiness of Democritia. When the Persian fleet made landfall at the Bay of Marathon, just 26 miles from the city, they didn't just bring 25,000 soldiers, they brought the threat of total absorption into an imperial machine. The Athenian decision to meet the Persians at the shore was a gamble of staggering proportions. The Greeks were outnumbered at least 2-1 and stood alone, as the Spartans, delayed by a religious festival, were nowhere to be seen. The 10,000 Athenian hoplites were citizen soldiers, farmers, potters, and poets who had donned their own bronze armor to defend their families. They represented the polis in its most literal form, a wall of human bronze that stood between their wives and children and the great king. The battlefield at Marathon was a narrow plain squeezed between the mountains and the sea. The Athenian general Miltiades, who understood Persian tactics from his time serving in their military, devised a brilliant but risky strategy. He thinned out his center to match the length of the Persian line while strengthening his wings. He knew the Persians relied on their elite archers and cavalry. His goal was to close the distance before the lethal rain of arrows could dismantle his ranks. Then occurred one of the most famous moments in military history, the charge. Instead of the usual slow, rhythmic march, the Greeks did the unthinkable. They ran. Covered in nearly 70 pounds of bronze, the hoplites sprinted the final few hundred yards. This maneuver completely nullified the Persian archers, who watched in disbelief as a wall of shields barreled toward them. The psychological impact was immense. The Persians had never seen a civilized army move with such ferocious, desperate speed. When the lines collided, the superiority of the Greek aspis, the heavy circular shield, and the long spear became evident. The Persians were lightly armored, wearing quilted tunics and carrying wicker shields that were useless against the thrust of a Greek dory. While the Persian center, composed of their best troops, managed to push the Athenians back, the reinforced Greek wings shattered the Persian flanks and folded inward. It was a classic double envelopment, a pincer move that turned the Persian line into a panicked mass of men fleeing toward their ships. The slaughter at the shore was brutal. The Greeks followed the retreating Persians into the water, even grabbing the sterns of the ships with their bare hands to prevent them from escaping. By the end of the day, 6,400 Persians lay dead on the plain, compared to only 192 Athenians. These fallen Greeks were not brought home. In a rare honor, they were buried on the battlefield under a massive earthen mound, the Soros, which still stands today as a monument to the citizen soldier. As the dust settled, the danger was not yet over. The remnants of the Persian fleet were sailing around Cape Sunion to attack the undefended city of Athens. This led to the legend of the messenger, often identified as Phidippides. According to tradition, he had already run 140 miles to Sparta and back, seeking help. Now, exhausted and blood-spattered, he ran the 26 miles from Marathon to the heart of Athens. He reached the city, shouted the single word, "Nenike kamen," "We have won," and collapsed dead from exhaustion. While historians debate the exact details of Phidippides' run, the symbolism of the 26-mile sprint, now the basis of the modern marathon, is undeniable. It represents the limit of human endurance in the service of the state. The message he delivered saved the city from a panic-induced surrender, giving the victorious hoplites time to march back from the battlefield and line the walls of Athens before the Persian ships arrived. Seeing the army they had just lost to waiting for them, the Persians turned their ships around and sailed back to Asia.
The victory at Marathon was the birth certificate of Western civilization. It proved that a small group of free citizens, motivated by the defense of their own homes and laws, could defeat the professional armies of a global empire. It gave the Greeks the confidence to continue their experiment in democracy and the arts. Without Marathon, there would be no Parthenon, no Socrates, and no Sophocles. The light of the classical age would have been extinguished before it truly began to glow. Ultimately, Marathon changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. It broke the myth of Persian invincibility and taught the West that East was not its master. For the Athenians, the 192 who died on that plain became secular saints, the Marathonomachoi. They had proved that a patch of earth was worth more than an empire's gold, and that the shield of a free man was the strongest wall ever built.
By 480 BCE, the Persian king of kings, Xerxes, had assembled a force so vast it was said to have drunk entire rivers dry as it marched. This was no longer just a punitive expedition like Marathon. It was a total invasion intended to erase Greek independence forever. To reach the heart of Greece, this massive machine had to pass through a narrow bottleneck between the Malian Gulf and the rugged cliffs of Mount Kallidromos, a place known as Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. Here, the Greek alliance made a desperate stand, choosing a terrain where the Persian numbers would count for nothing and Greek bronze would count for everything. The leadership of this suicide mission fell to the Spartan king Leonidas. While the Greek force totaled a few thousand, the core was the 300 Spartans, elite warriors who had all sired sons to carry on their names. They were the equals in their final form, men for whom the agoge had been a lifelong preparation for this singular moment. They didn't come to win a war, they came to hold a gate. Their presence gave the rest of the Greek city-states the precious days needed to mobilize their fleets and evacuate their cities. The geography of the pass was the Greeks' greatest ally. At its narrowest, the track was only wide enough for a single wagon to pass. This neutralized the Persians' greatest advantage, their overwhelming numbers. Xerxes could only send a few thousand men at a time into the meat grinder of the Greek phalanx. For 2 days, wave after wave of Persian infantry, including the elite immortals, shattered against the wall of Spartan shields. The Persians fought under the whip of their officers, but the Greeks fought for the soil beneath their sandals. The equipment of the Spartans was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. The auspice, their heavy wood and bronze shield, covered them from chin to knee. When locked together in a phalanx, they created a seamless barrier that Persian arrows and short spears simply could not penetrate. The Spartans used their superior reach with the dori, spear, to strike from behind their bronze wall, turning the narrow pass into a charnel house for the Persian invaders. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne on the heights, reportedly leapt to his feet in terror as he watched his finest troops fail to break the Greek line. The tide turned not through a failure of Greek arms, but through a failure of Greek character. A local resident named Ephialtes, hoping for a Persian reward, revealed a secret mountain path, the Oenopeia path, that led behind the Greek lines. On the 3rd day, the Greeks realized they were being surrounded. Leonidas dismissed the majority of the allied army to save them for future battles, but he and his 300 Spartans, along with 700 courageous Thespians and 400 Thebans, remained. They chose to stay,
bound by the Spartan law that forbade retreat, even in the face of certain death. The final stand was a brutal, chaotic melee. Driven onto a small hillock within the pass, the remaining Greeks fought with spears until they broke, then with short swords, and finally with their hands and teeth. Leonidas fell early in the fighting, and the struggle over his body was so fierce that the Greeks had to beat back the Persians 4 times to recover their king. Eventually, the Persians, unwilling to face the dying lions in hand-to-hand combat, retreated to a distance and finished the last of the Greeks with a literal rain of arrows. While Thermopylae was a tactical defeat, the pass was lost, and the road to Athens lay open. It was a strategic and psychological masterpiece. The delay allowed the Athenian navy to prepare for the decisive Battle of Salamis, but more importantly, it provided the Greeks with a foundational myth. The news that a king and his guard had died to a man for the sake of common Hellenic liberty electrified the Greek world. It transformed a collection of squabbling cities into a unified nation of resistance. The epitaph later placed at the site by the poet Simonides became the most famous couplet in history. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." This was the ultimate expression of the laconic spirit. It wasn't a boast or a lament. It was a simple statement of duty fulfilled. The 300 had proved that the Persian king of kings might own the earth, but he did not own the spirit of a free man. The sacrifice at the Hot Gates also exposed the fundamental weakness of the Persian Empire. Xerxes' soldiers were subjects, many of them conscripted from conquered lands and forced to fight. The Spartans were citizens who had chosen their fate. Thermopylae taught the Persians that every inch of Greek soil would be bought with an unacceptable amount of Persian blood. It moved the war from a contest of geography to a contest of willpower, a field where the Greeks were increasingly dominant. Thermopylae remains the ultimate symbol of the glorious defeat. It is a reminder that there are values higher than survival, and that a lost battle can sometimes win a war. By standing their ground at the gate of fire, Leonidas and his men ensured that the shared identity of
After the heroic failure at Thermopylae, the Persian juggernaut poured into central Greece. The Athenians faced a harrowing choice: stay and die defending their stone walls, or trust in the wooden wall of their fleet. Guided by the cunning Themistocles, they chose the latter, abandoning their city to the torch. From the decks of their ships, Athenian families watched as the Acropolis burned, the smoke of their temples rising into the Attic sky. It was a moment of total desperation. The polis was no longer a piece of land, but a collection of hulls floating in the narrow straits of Salamis. Themistocles knew that in the open sea, the sheer numbers and seafaring expertise of the Persian fleet, comprised of Phoenician, Egyptian, and Ionian sailors, would overwhelm the Greeks. He needed to neutralize their numerical advantage. Through a brilliant act of deception, he sent a trusted slave to King Xerxes with a message. The Greeks were terrified and intended to flee under the cover of night. Xerxes, eager for a final, decisive blow, swallowed the bait and ordered his massive fleet to enter the cramped, treacherous waters of Salamis Straits. As the sun rose over the Aegean Sea, the Persians found themselves trapped. Their vast numbers, which should have been their greatest strength, became their undoing. In the narrow channel, the large, high-decked Persian ships became a tangled, chaotic mess, unable to turn or maneuver.
The Greeks, meanwhile, were in their element. They had spent years practicing in these very waters, and their triremes, sleek, fast, and agile, were perfectly designed for the naval guerrilla warfare that was about to unfold. From a golden throne perched on the slopes of Mount Aegialeus, King Xerxes watched the spectacle with increasing horror. He had expected a slaughter of the rebels. Instead, he witnessed the systematic destruction of his imperial navy. Every time a Persian ship tried to advance, an Athenian or Aegianitan trireme would dart forward, its bronze-sheathed ram punching through the enemy's wooden hull at the waterline. The straits became a graveyard of splintered timber and drowning men, many of whom, unlike the Greeks, did not know how to swim. The tactical advantage of the Greek trireme lay in its lower center of gravity and the discipline of its rowers. Unlike the Persian ships, which carried large numbers of marines that made them top-heavy, the Athenian ships were living missiles. The rowers, mostly the poor thetes of Athens, moved with a single rhythmic pulse. When they struck, they didn't just hit the enemy, they sheared off oars and crushed hulls, leaving the Persian vessels dead in the water and ripe for boarding. The slaughter was not just a matter of technology, but of morale. The Greeks were fighting with their backs to the wall, or rather, their backs to the wreckage of their homes. If they lost at Salamis, there was no second chance. Their families, waiting on the nearby shores, would be enslaved or executed. The Persians, conversely, were a multi-ethnic conscript force fighting for a distant king. When the Phoenician and Egyptian contingents saw the Greek veracity, their resolve crumbled, and the retreat turned into a panicked rout. By the time the sun began to set, the blue waters of the Saronic Gulf were dyed red. Hundreds of Persian ships were sunk or captured, while the Greeks had only lost a few dozen. Xerxes, fearing that the victorious Greeks would sail to the Hellespont and destroy his bridge back to Asia, panicked. He fled Greece with a large portion of his remaining army, leaving his general Mardonius behind to finish a war that had already been lost on the waves. The victory at Salamis was the ultimate validation of the Athenian democracy. It was the common man, the rower at the oar, who had saved Greece. This shifted the political gravity of Athens forever, ensuring that the voices of the poor would be just as loud as the voices of the rich in the assembly. The silver of Laurion had been successfully converted into the security of the West, proving that Themistocles' long-term vision had been correct. Philosophically, Salamis represented the triumph of individual initiative over imperial command. The Greek captains were free men who understood the plan and executed it with autonomy, while the Persian captains were paralyzed by the fear of failing their king. This cultural difference, the move from being a subject to being a citizen, is the true legacy of the battle. It was at Salamis that the concept of Europe as a distinct political and cultural entity began to coalesce against the autocracy of the East. If the Persians had won, the Greek miracle would have been strangled in its crib. There would have been no Parthenon, no Aristotle, and no foundations for the Roman or Renaissance worlds. By holding the straits, the Greeks ensured that their experiments in logic, art, and self-governance would have the time to mature and eventually spread across the globe. The smoke over Athens eventually cleared, and from the ashes of the Persian fire, the Golden Age was born.
The Golden Age of Athens was a shimmering, fragile peak that eventually collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. By 431 BCE, the Greek world was no longer a unified front against Persia, but a house divided into two armed camps. On one side stood the Delian League,
led by Athens, a maritime empire that had turned its allies into subjects. On the other was the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, a conservative land power that feared the creeping democracy and growing naval reach of its rival. The historian Thucydides noted that the war was inevitable because of the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. The strategies of the two powers were fundamentally incompatible, leading to a grueling stalemate. Pericles, the leader of Athens, convinced his citizens to abandon the countryside and retreat behind their long walls, which connected the city to the port of Piraeus. He knew Sparta could dominate the land, so he relied on the Athenian fleet to bring in food and strike the Spartan coast. This island strategy turned Athens into a crowded, claustrophobic fortress, while just outside the walls, the Spartans burned the olive groves and grain fields in a relentless campaign of scorched earth tactics. In the second year of the war, disaster struck from within. The crowded conditions behind the long walls became a breeding ground for a horrific plague. For 3 years, the disease decimated the population, killing roughly 1/3 of the city, including Pericles himself. The plague did more than just kill people. It killed the Athenian spirit. Seeing the good and the bad die alike, survivors abandoned the laws of gods and men, leading to a breakdown in social order that the city would never fully recover from. As the war dragged on, the initial noble ideals of both sides evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating brutality. This was most famously captured in the Melian dialogue, where Athenian ambassadors told the neutral islanders of Melos that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. When the Melians refused to submit, the Athenians executed every man and enslaved every woman and child. This moral decay signaled that the school of Hellas had become a school of tyrants. The turning point came with the disastrous Sicilian expedition in 415 BCE. Driven by the charismatic but reckless Alcibiades, Athens sent a massive fleet to conquer Syracuse, hoping to secure new resources. It was a gamble of epic proportions that ended in total catastrophe. The Athenian army was annihilated, and thousands of soldiers were left to rot in the limestone quarries of Sicily. Athens lost its best ships and its most experienced rowers in a single stroke, a blow that would have forced any other city to surrender immediately. Surprisingly, Athens fought on for another 9 years, displaying a demonic resilience. However, the nature of the conflict shifted as Sparta did the unthinkable. They accepted Persian gold. The great king, seeing an opportunity to destroy the Greeks from within, funded a Spartan navy. This changed the fundamental nature of the war. The land power was now fighting the naval power on the waves. Sparta, under the ruthless general Lysander, finally had the tools to cut off the Athenian grain supply from the Black Sea. The final blow landed at Aegospotami in 405 BCE. Lysander caught the Athenian fleet beached and unprepared, capturing or destroying nearly every ship. Without a navy, the long walls became a prison rather than a shield. Starvation gripped Athens as the Spartan army blockaded the city by land and sea. In 404 BCE, the city that had birthed democracy and defeated the Persians was forced to surrender on humiliating terms. The peace terms were brutal. The Spartans forced the Athenians to tear down the long walls to the sound of flute players as if celebrating a festival. The democracy was abolished and replaced by a pro-Spartan oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, who began a reign of terror, executing hundreds of citizens. Though democracy was eventually restored a year later, the Golden Age was dead. The city was a shadow of its former self, its treasury empty, and its confidence shattered. The war's legacy was a spiritual bankruptcy that affected all of Greece. The economy was in ruins, and the constant fighting had decimated the population of young men. The trust between city-states was gone, replaced by a cycle of petty wars and shifting alliances. Sparta's own hegemony was short-lived, as they lacked the political imagination to lead a unified Greece. The vacuum of power left by the exhaustion of the south allowed a new power to rise in the north, Macedonia. Ultimately, the Peloponnesian War was a tragic proof that the greatest threat to Greek civilization was not the barbarian from without, but the Greek from within. The very energy and competitiveness that had created the Parthenon and the Olympic Games had turned inward, devouring the culture it had built. When King Philip of Macedonia finally marched south a few decades later, he didn't find a forest of vibrant city-states. He found a collection of scorched ruins and weary people, ready for a conqueror to end their long, self-inflicted nightmare.
The year 399 BCE was a dark chapter in the history of Athens. The city was a wounded animal, still reeling from its crushing defeat in the Peloponnesian War and the bloody reign of the 30 tyrants. The confidence that had once fueled the Golden Age had soured into suspicion and paranoia. In this climate of spiritual exhaustion, the Athenians began looking for a scapegoat, someone to blame for the city's loss of divine favor. They found their target in a 70-year-old man with a snub nose and tattered cloak who spent his days in the agora, Socrates. Socrates was not a typical philosopher. He wrote nothing down and held no formal classes. Instead, he practiced the Socratic method, a form of cooperative, argumentative dialogue that used pointed questions to expose the contradictions and ignorance of his peers. He called himself a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse of Athens into thinking. However, after decades of being stung, the elite of Athens, many of whom had been embarrassed by Socrates in public, were no longer in the mood for self-reflection. The formal charges brought against him were twofold: impiety, not believing in the gods of the city, and corrupting the youth. These were politically motivated umbrella charges. Many of the young men who had followed Socrates, including the traitorous Alcibiades and the tyrant Critias, had caused great harm to the city. While Socrates himself had never supported the tyrants, the public associated his habit of questioning traditional authority with the moral decay that had led to Athens' downfall. The trial took place before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens. In a modern court, a defendant might plead for mercy, but Socrates remained defiant. He argued that he was a benefactor to the state and that his questioning was a divine mission. When asked to propose his own punishment after being found guilty, he mockingly suggested that he should be given free meals for life in the Prytaneum, an honor reserved for Olympic victors. This refusal to play the submissive role sealed his fate. The jury voted for death. For 30 days, Socrates sat in a stone prison near the agora, awaiting execution. His wealthy friends, including his devoted student Crito, arranged a foolproof plan for him to escape into exile. They argued that by staying, he was helping his enemies commit an injustice. But Socrates refused.
He argued that he had lived as a citizen under the laws of Athens his entire life and benefited from them. To break them now, just because they had turned against him, would be a betrayal of his own principles. The scene of his final hours is one of the most famous in Western literature, immortalized by his student Plato in the Phaedo. Surrounded by weeping friends, Socrates remained the most composed person in the room. He viewed death not as an end, but a final healing of the soul from the distractions of the body. He spent his last moments not in prayer, but in a calm, logical discussion about the immortality of the soul, treating his own execution as the final step in a lifelong philosophical experiment. When the executioner brought the cup of hemlock, a powerful neurotoxin that causes a slow, upward paralysis, Socrates took it without a tremor. He drank the poison as if it were a libation, walked around until his legs felt heavy, and then lay down. His final words were famously enigmatic. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it, and do not neglect it." Asclepius was the god of healing. By offering a sacrifice to him, Socrates was suggesting that death was the cure for the sickness of life. The death of Socrates was a catastrophic own goal for Athenian democracy. By killing their most famous thinker, the Athenians turned a local nuisance into a global martyr for logic. The execution sent a shockwave through the intellectual world, proving that the tyranny of the majority could be just as deadly as the whim of a king. It established a permanent tension between the philosopher and the state, a conflict that would define Western political thought for centuries. The torch of Socrates' mission was picked up by his most brilliant student, Plato. Devastated by the injustice of the democracy, Plato abandoned his political ambitions and founded the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the West. Through his dialogues, Plato ensured that Socrates' voice would never be silenced. He used the memory of his teacher to explore the idea of the philosopher king and the search for absolute truths that existed beyond the fickle opinions of the marketplace. Ultimately, Socrates' legacy is the examined life. He taught that a life without questioning, without digging beneath the surface of tradition and ego, was not worth living. His death proved that while a body can be stopped by poison, an idea, once set loose in the minds of the youth, is immortal. Because Socrates died for his questions, those questions still echo today, challenging every generation to look in the mirror and ask, "Do you truly know what you think you know?"
In the somber wake of Socrates' execution, his most gifted student, Plato, realized that for philosophy to survive, it needed a sanctuary, a place where the pursuit of truth could be shielded from the volatile whims of the Athenian mob. Around 387 BCE, he established the Academy in a grove of olive trees outside the city walls. It was the world's first true university, a center for higher learning where students gathered not just to listen to lectures, but to engage in rigorous mathematical and dialectic research. Over the entrance, legend says, were the words, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Plato's philosophy was anchored in the theory of forms. He argued that the physical world we perceive through our senses is merely a shadowy, imperfect reflection of a higher, eternal world of ideas. To Plato, a drawn circle is never perfect, but the concept of a circle is. This led him to prioritize abstract reasoning and mathematics as the ultimate tools for understanding reality. His academy became a beacon for those who sought the ideal, influencing everything from Christian theology to modern theoretical physics. After 20 years of studying at the academy,
Plato's most brilliant pupil, Aristotle, took a radically different path. While he respected his master, Aristotle was a man of the earth rather than the clouds. After a stint tutoring the young Alexander the Great, Aristotle returned to Athens to found his own school, the Lyceum. Unlike the secluded academy, the Lyceum was a peripatetic school, named after the peripatoi, colonnades where Aristotle would walk with his students while discussing the complexities of the natural world. The Lyceum was the world's first comprehensive research institute. Aristotle was not content with abstract forms, he wanted data. He amassed the first great library of antiquity and established a massive collection of botanical and zoological specimens. He pioneered the empirical method, the idea that knowledge must be built from the ground up through observation, measurement, and classification. If Plato was the father of philosophy, Aristotle was the father of the life sciences. Aristotle's obsession with classification transformed the study of biology. He spent years on the island of Lesbos observing marine life, correctly identifying that dolphins were mammals rather than fish. He developed a ladder of being, or scala naturae, a hierarchy that classified organisms based on their complexity. This was the first systematic attempt to organize the staggering diversity of life, a framework that remained the gold standard for biology until the time of Charles Darwin. This drive to classify extended to the human world of politics. While Plato's Republic described a theoretical ideal state ruled by philosopher kings, Aristotle's Politics was a practical study of 158 different city-state constitutions. He analyzed how governments actually functioned, categorizing them into types like monarchy, aristocracy, and polity. He looked for the golden mean, the idea that the best government was one that avoided the extremes of both tyranny and total mob rule. The tension between these two thinkers, the idealism of Plato and the empiricism of Aristotle, created the great debate that has fueled Western intellectual history for 2,000 years. This dynamic was famously captured by the Renaissance artist Raphael in his fresco The School of Athens. In the center, Plato points his finger upward toward the heavenly ideas, while Aristotle holds his hand flat toward the earth, emphasizing the importance of the physical, observable world. The Academy and the Lyceum also revolutionized the way knowledge was transmitted. They moved away from the oral tradition of the poets and toward the written treatise. Their schools produced the books that would become the curriculum of the medieval university. Aristotle's logic, known as the organon, became the essential toolkit for anyone trying to build a rational argument, while Plato's dialogues provided the framework for exploring ethics and the soul. The influence of these institutes was preserved through a series of remarkable historical handoffs. When the Roman Empire rose, they adopted the Greek schools. When the Western Roman Empire fell, Islamic scholars in Baghdad translated and expanded upon the works of Aristotle and Plato. In the 12th century, these texts returned to Europe, sparking the scholastic movement and the Renaissance. For 2 millennia, to be educated was quite literally to be a student of the Academy or the Lyceum. Ultimately, Plato and Aristotle mapped the boundaries of human inquiry. Plato gave us the why, the search for meaning, purpose, and the divine. Aristotle gave us the how, the tools of logic, observation, and scientific classification. Together, they ensured that the Greek miracle was not just a collection of temples and statues, but a permanent architectural plan for the human mind. Their schools proved that while empires crumble and cities burn, a well-reasoned idea is the most enduring thing humanity can create.
While the southern city-states of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes were trapped in a cycle of hegemonic wars, draining their treasuries and their youth, the kingdom of Macedonia was undergoing a radical transformation. Long dismissed by the southern Greeks as semi-barbarians who lived in the cold northern forests, the Macedonians were reorganized by the brilliant and ruthless King Philip II. Philip had spent time as a royal hostage in Thebes, where he observed the tactical innovations of the great general Epaminondas. He realized that if he could combine Greek tactical sophistication with the raw manpower of the north, he could forge an unstoppable empire. Philip's most transformative invention was the Macedonian phalanx. He took the traditional Greek hoplite formation and radically altered its equipment. Instead of the standard 8-foot spear, Philip armed his infantry with the sarissa, a massive pike measuring between 16 and 18 feet in length. These pikes were so heavy they required 2 hands to hold, meaning the soldiers carried smaller shields strapped to their shoulders. In formation, the first 5 ranks of pikes protruded forward, creating an impenetrable forest of sharpened iron that could impale an enemy long before they could reach the Macedonian line with a shorter Greek spear. The sarissa was not just a weapon of offense, it was a psychological tool. As the phalanx marched, the rear ranks held their pikes upright, creating a dense thicket that deflected incoming arrows and hid the movements of the troops behind. The sound of thousands of 18-foot pikes clattering together was described as a terrifying mechanical roar. This Macedonian hedgehog turned the infantry into a mobile fortress, a slow-moving but relentless wall of death that traditional Greek armies simply had no answer for. Philip also understood that a hammer needs an anvil. While the phalanx, the anvil, pinned the enemy in place, he perfected the use of the companion cavalry, the hammer. Composed of the Macedonian nobility, these were the elite shock troops of the ancient world. Unlike the southern Greeks, who often used cavalry merely for scouting or skirmishing, Philip trained his horsemen to charge in a wedge formation, punching through weak points in the enemy line. This combined arms approach, heavy infantry holding the front while heavy cavalry struck the flank, became the blueprint for professional warfare. Philip's conquest of Greece was a masterclass in salami tactics, slicing away pieces of Greek territory through a mix of bribery, diplomacy, and siege warfare. He utilized advanced torsion catapults and siege towers to break the walls of cities that had stood for centuries. While the Athenian orator Demosthenes gave fiery speeches warning that Philip was a barbarian, threatening Greek liberty, Philip was busy buying off politicians in every major city. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a unifier who would lead a crusade against the old enemy, Persia. The definitive end of the era of the independent polis came in 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea. A combined force of Athenians and Thebans met the Macedonians in a final attempt to preserve their autonomy. It was here that the power of the sarissa was fully realized. The Macedonian phalanx ground down the Greek hoplites, while a young prince named Alexander led the decisive cavalry charge that shattered the elite Theban sacred band. When the dust settled, the supremacy of the southern city-states was over. The freedom of Greece had been traded for the order of the Macedonian throne. Philip's reforms also revolutionized the Macedonian economy. By seizing the gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeum, he was able to mint the Philippic gold coins, which became the most stable currency in the Mediterranean. This wealth allowed him to maintain a permanent standing army. Unlike the Athenian farmers who had to go home for the harvest,
Philip's soldiers were professionals who trained year-round. This professionalization of violence meant that the Macedonian machine was always ready, always sharp, and always expanding. Despite his brilliance, Philip's life ended in a manner typical of the violent Macedonian court. In 336 BCE, he was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during a wedding festival. He left behind a kingdom that stretched from the Danube to the Peloponnese, a military system that was the finest in the world, and a treasury overflowing with gold. Most importantly, he left behind a clear objective: the invasion of the Persian Empire. The stage was set, and the Macedonian machine was fueled and idling. The legacy of Philip II is often overshadowed by the meteoric career of his son, yet Alexander the Great would have been a mere footnote in history without the Sarissa and the professional army his father built. Philip had broken the mold of the ancient world, proving that the future belonged to large centralized territorial states rather than small idealistic city-states. He had closed the door on the classical age and opened the door to a world of kings and empires, leaving his 20-year-old son with the keys to the most powerful engine of conquest ever created.
When Alexander III of Macedon crossed the Hellespont into Asia in 334 BCE, he was just 20 years old, yet he carried the weight of his father's professional army and the unquenchable fire of his own ambition. He didn't just see himself as a king, he viewed himself as a new Achilles, destined to surpass the legends of the Iliad. His campaign was a relentless whirlwind that spanned 11 years and covered over 11,000 miles, stretching from the sun-drenched coasts of Greece to the monsoon-soaked riverbanks of India. It was an expedition that sought the very edges of the known world, driven by a man who refused to believe in the word impossible. The military heart of his success remained the Macedonian phalanx, but Alexander utilized it with a tactical genius that was almost supernatural. At the Battle of Gaugamela, he faced a Persian force that vastly outnumbered him on a plain specially leveled to favor Persian chariots. Alexander didn't flinch. He led a daring diagonal charge with his companion cavalry, aiming like a spearhead directly at the Persian king Darius III. This strike at the head broke the Persian resolve and effectively collapsed the largest empire the world had ever seen, shifting the center of global power in a single afternoon. Alexander was not a traditional conqueror who sought to merely hoard gold and return home. He was a builder. Everywhere his army marched, he laid the foundations for new urban centers, eventually founding over 70 cities named Alexandria. The most famous of these, Alexandria in Egypt, was designed on a grid system with wide boulevards and became the intellectual capital of the world. These cities acted as cultural garrisons, bringing Greek architecture, marketplaces, and administrative systems to the heart of Central Asia and the banks of the Nile. The spread of the Greek language, specifically the Koine, common dialect, acted as the internet of the ancient world. Because of Alexander's conquests, a merchant in Athens could communicate with a scholar in Afghanistan using the same tongue. This linguistic unification allowed for an unprecedented flow of ideas, commerce, and philosophy. The Greek theater followed the army, with massive stone amphitheaters carved into hillsides in places like Ai-Khanum in modern-day Afghanistan, where locals watched the tragedies of Sophocles under the stars of the East. Economics were also revolutionized through the spread of Greek coinage. Alexander seized the vast gold and silver reserves of the Persian kings and converted them into millions of silver tetradrachms. These coins, featuring the image of Alexander as Heracles or Zeus, became the standard currency of international trade.
By monetizing the wealth of the East and injecting it into a Mediterranean-wide system, he created a globalized economy that allowed trade to flourish from the Adriatic to the Indus long after he was gone. Perhaps the most radical aspect of his reign was his policy of cultural fusion. Alexander didn't want to be a Greek king ruling over barbarians. He wanted to be the great king of a unified people. He began wearing Persian royal dress, adopted Eastern court rituals like proskynesis, bowing before the king, and incorporated Persian soldiers into his elite units. This horrified his Macedonian generals, who viewed it as a betrayal of their heritage. But for Alexander, it was the only way to hold a multi-ethnic empire together. This vision reached its peak at the Susa weddings in 324 BCE. In a massive choreographed ceremony, Alexander and 80 of his top officers married high-ranking Persian noblewomen. At the same time, over 10,000 of his soldiers were officially wed to their Eastern partners. It was an attempt to forcibly marry the DNA of the West and the East, creating a new hybrid ruling class that would owe its loyalty only to him. He was literally breeding a new world order in the hopes of ending the ancient cycle of us versus them. The mixing of cultures extended into the realm of the divine. In Egypt, Alexander traveled deep into the Sahara to consult the oracle of Zeus Ammon, who allegedly addressed him as the son of God. This allowed him to bridge the gap between Greek and Egyptian religions, merging Zeus with the sun god Ammon. This religious syncretism became a hallmark of the Hellenistic age, where gods from different traditions were often merged, interpretatio Graeca, creating a more universal and inclusive spiritual landscape. Alexander's journey finally halted not by enemy hands, but by the exhaustion of his own men. At the Hyphasis River in India, his soldiers, weary from a decade of rain, tropical diseases, and fighting war elephants, finally mutinied and refused to go further. Alexander, reportedly weeping in his tent, was forced to turn back. He died shortly after in Babylon at the age of 32, likely from a combination of fever, exhaustion, and old wounds. He left no clear heir, famously whispering on his deathbed that his empire should go to the strongest. The death of Alexander marked the birth of the Hellenistic age. His empire shattered into several successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedon, but the cultural seeds he had sown had already taken root. The Hellenized East would later provide the foundation for the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity. Alexander had failed to create a lasting political union, but he had succeeded in something far greater. He had made the world smaller, proving that while geography separates us, the spirit of the polis and the pursuit of greatness could unite humanity across any distance.
When Alexander the Great died in Babylon at the age of 32, he left behind a power vacuum that triggered a 40-year civil war among his generals, the Diadochi. The empire was eventually carved into several major successor states: the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the Near East, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia. While the political unity of Alexander's realm vanished overnight, the cultural infrastructure he had laid down proved indestructible. This era, known as the Hellenistic Age, saw the Greek way of life transcend the borders of the polis to become the first truly globalized culture. In this new world, the Greek language, koine, became the essential currency of the Mediterranean and Western Asia. A merchant from Syracuse in Sicily could travel through the markets of Ephesus, stop at the great library of Alexandria, and continue on to the Greek-controlled cities of the Indus Valley, all while speaking a single tongue.
This linguistic unification facilitated an unprecedented explosion of trade and the rapid migration of ideas. It was an age of cosmopolitanism, literally being a citizen of the world, where one's identity was no longer strictly tied to a single city-state. The crown jewel of this era was Alexandria in Egypt, a city designed to be the intellectual engine of the world. Under the Ptolemies, the city became home to the museum, the Temple of the Muses, and the Great Library, which aimed to collect every book ever written in the Greek and barbarian worlds. Scholars like Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth, and Euclid, the father of geometry, worked here. Knowledge was no longer a local pursuit. It was a centralized, industrial-scale effort to catalog the entirety of human experience. Science and technology reached heights that would not be surpassed for nearly 2 millennia. The Hellenistic mind was obsessed with mechanics and mathematics. Archimedes of Syracuse developed the principles of buoyancy and levers, while Ctesias invented water-powered organs and clocks. This was the era of the Antikythera mechanism, a complex geared device used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses, essentially the world's first analog computer. The Greek mind was no longer just debating the world of ideas, it was actively re-engineering the physical world. The arts also underwent a dramatic shift from the classical to the Hellenistic style. In the 5th century BCE, statues were idealized and calm. In the 3rd century BCE, they became intensely emotional and realistic. Masterpieces like the Laocoon and his Sons or the Winged Victory of Samothrace captured tension, agony, and movement with a theatricality that mirrored the grand scale of the successor kingdoms. This Baroque phase of Greek art sought to move the viewer with raw human feeling rather than just mathematical proportion. Philosophy evolved to meet the needs of a more uncertain, globalized world. The old civic religions, focused on the city's gods, felt distant in a world ruled by remote kings. In response, schools like Stoicism and Epicureanism emerged, focusing on the individual's internal peace. The Stoics taught that one should focus only on what they can control, while the Epicureans sought the absence of pain and fear. These philosophies provided a portable moral code that a person could carry with them, whether they lived in a Greek city or a Persian village. Religious boundaries also began to blur through syncretism, the blending of different beliefs. In Egypt, the Ptolemies created the god Serapis, who combined the Greek Zeus and Hades with the Egyptian Osiris and Apis. This was a deliberate attempt to provide a unified religious focus for both the Greek ruling class and the native Egyptian population. Across the East, Greek gods were translated into local contexts, and in the Far East, Greek artistic styles even began to influence the first human depictions of the Buddha in the region of Gandhara. The economy of the 3rd century BCE was characterized by massive trade networks and sophisticated banking. The successor kings minted millions of standard coins, facilitating a Great Silk Road precursor that brought spices from India, incense from Arabia, and silks from China into the Mediterranean. The wealth of the East was no longer hoarded in Persian palaces, but was circulating through the ports of Rhodes and Corinth, creating a level of material luxury that the Greeks of Socrates' time could never have imagined. While the Greek kingdoms were eventually eclipsed by the rising power of the Roman Republic, the Roman conquest was a military victory, not a cultural one. As the poet Horace famously wrote, "Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror." The Romans adopted Greek architecture, literature, philosophy, and religion, essentially becoming the stewards of Hellenism. The Roman Empire, in many ways, was the final and largest of the Hellenistic successor states, providing a Latin infrastructure for a Greek-minded world. The legacy of the Hellenistic age is the very foundation of Western and Middle Eastern thought. When the New Testament was written centuries later, it was written in the Koine Greek of Alexander's world. When the Renaissance scholars looked back to find the roots of modern science and art, as the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting long golden shadows across the weathered marble of the Parthenon, we are reminded that even the most vibrant civilizations have their season of rest. The Greeks understood this rhythm better than anyone, the balance between the exhausting pursuit of greatness, arete, and the quiet restoration of the soul. They knew that the same mind capable of mapping the stars and debating the nature of justice also required the stillness of the night to reflect on the day's inquiries. The Greek miracle was not built in a single restless burst, but through centuries of waking to the dawn and retiring to the hearth. Just as the fires of the oikos were banked for the night to preserve the embers for tomorrow, the legacy of Hellas remains a steady, glowing light in the archives of human history. Their stories of heroes, their complex riddles, and their search for truth continue to watch over us, providing a familiar map through the darkness of the unknown. Now the agora is silent. The echoes of the philosophers have faded into the starlight, and the great theaters sit empty under the watchful gaze of Mount Parnassus. The examined life requires a moment of peace to integrate all that has been learned, seen, and felt. We have traveled from the narrow pass of Thermopylae to the vast libraries of Alexandria, and now, like a weary traveler returning to the safety of the fold, it is time to set aside the shield and the scroll. So let the logic of Aristotle and the dreams of Plato guide your rest. The questions of the day have been asked, the races have been run, and the sacred truce of sleep now begins. Close your eyes and drift into the quiet, knowing that the foundations of the world are secure, and the wisdom of the ancients remains to greet you when the sun once again touches the peaks of Olympus. It is time to rest. It is time to sleep. Good night.